Hi everyone, welcome to the second mega video in the Margiela series. Here I have taken 15 videos from the regular series and crunched them all together into a single large video. Part 1 is linked down in the description. I made these so that people could just watch the entire series in one compacted video if they wanted to. So this is an optional way to watch it. The Margiela series is still going. We're releasing about one new video from it per month. And if you want to watch the full extended unedited versions of these episodes, you can join the Patreon. I will waste no more of your time. Let's get into it. Oh hi, I didn't see you there. My name is Bliss Foster, and today, we are covering Maison Martin Margiela Spring-Summer 1997. This is one of the single most important metaphors, imagery, single pictures in the Maison's history. We are going to have a gigantic all rise, but not until the time is right. Here we have a showroom setting instead of a traditional runway show. The Maison has done this a number of different times. They also created a on-the-street short film for this collection, and the showroom itself was decorated with lots of artificial sunflowers. It's important to note here that this is one of a two-part presentation, and we'll see in the next episode why it is so important that these presentations be lumped together and thought of as a single piece. In the showroom, they played Muzak, which is like that atmosphere-enhancing elevator music type stuff. The history of Muzak is actually a pretty keen metaphor for the Maison's work generally. The original tech that led to Muzak was created in the 19-teens so that stores and public places could have some form of environmental kind of atmospheric music, but without having to have a full-on radio installed, because at the time radios were very large, they were extremely expensive, and they were really difficult to maintain. What Muzak did is it allowed them to just technologically wire in only the necessary pieces so that they could have exactly what they wanted. Much like how the Maison kind of stops things part of the way through or only takes in like the necessary pieces, they leave things kind of undone, but the goals are still achieved. Muzak was also accused of being a brainwashing tool in the 1950s, which is hilarious and also fits in really well with the surrealistic elements that the Maison does generally. Because like imagine walking into this space, cheesy 70s mall music plays everywhere, and then a woman walks up to you cosplaying as a vintage dress form and offers you a solo cup of red wine. And suddenly we're in a David Lynch film. Okay, so we're gonna cover this show a little bit differently than we've covered other Maison Martin Margiela shows. The real key to this show, and really to, it could be argued to Martin's career generally, is the Stockman jacket. And so we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about why this piece symbolically is so important to the story of the Maison. Let's move around here a little bit. In previous shows, the Maison questioned the fashion system by taking old garments and then recontextualizing them into new fashion. Here and now in the present, that isn't really a novel concept. Everybody thrifts, but in Paris specifically, this was a revolutionary concept, right? So we've covered that for the entire series. But here in this season, we see a notable flip on that concept. We do see Martin reaching back in order to recontextualize, but it's something from his past and his present. The social relationships of production. Comrade, it is time to talk about labor in fashion. So there were actually two designers who were both talking about this crucial issue of women's bodies' relationship with their clothes in the same season of Paris Fashion Week. Martin Margiela and Grandma Ray Kawakubo. Spring-Summer 1997 was also the season that we were blessed with the seminal Comme des Garçons runway show, Body Meets Dress, Dress Meets Body, or as it is more affectionately known, the Lumps and Bumps collection. Grandma Ray's methods are wildly unorthodox. There literally is not another designer like her. In a rare moment of transparency, Ray gave a statement about this collection saying, quote, "I want to rethink the body so the body and the dress become one," end quote. And then on the other hand, Martin was exploring this same idea through the concept of production in fashion. And the symbol that he used, the metaphor in order to talk about production, is an object that is necessary for the production of all fashion. The dress form. No way. Nosebleed check, stand by. And we're back. In fashion theory, there's often this discussion of subject and object. The subject is you, me. It's a person with a body that has to wear clothes in order to live and function in society. Because we do, after all, live in a society. The object, on the other hand, is clothing, so subject and object. But there's this disconnect between subject and object. Have you ever wondered why so many clothes just don't seem to fit right? All of us know what our size is, but there is this inherent tension between our bodies and the clothes of the world. Margiela is attempting through this collection to unite the subject and the object through the social relationships of production. In the brilliant book, Fashion in Materialism, the author, Lehman, says, quote, "The production of the object through labor is defined as a conscious process for social change," end quote. Martin is talking about social change, and when he says that, he's talking about the change between the relationship that women have with their bodies and the clothes that they put on them. Let's define some terms real quick so we're all on the same page. The social relationships of production are really not that complex. All this is doing is it's asking the question, are women empowered by wearing clothes that are never designed for them in the first place, or do women suffer under a system of power involving the clothes that they wear? What is this system of power that Margiela is speaking to? I'm bored, let's move. 20th century fashion kind of discovered women's bodies. We moved from a period of heavy augmentation of women's bodies into one where it seemed better because we were more appreciative of their natural form, right? Because before, say, 1920, there were all these artificial scaffolding and body parts like peignets and bustles. The idea of switching from that to clothing that actually acknowledges the natural female body seems like a really great piece of progress. But is it that great? Or is it just different? Because the rise of off-the-rack clothes, pret-a-porter, meant that everyone's clothes were now being standardized into sizing rather than the clothes being made for the individual like they were before this change in fashion. I believe that this show and the Comme des Garçons show are both reacting to the heroin chic movement in the 90s. One of the primary pillars of that movement was headed up by a young man from Austin, Texas named Thomas Carlyle Ford. Tom Ford's first collection at Gucci was not Fall/Winter 1995, but that was for sure the collection that put him on the map. This collection, along with other cultural hallmarks of the heroin chic movement like this Calvin Klein ad, were pitching women's bodies in a new light. Tom called it sexy. He said it was a rejection of the retro chic that had been so dominant for the first half of the 90s. And so he sent models down the runway and pretty literally redefined what sexy meant in the 1990s. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But this new brand of sexiness was most dominantly defined by depictions of women who were incredibly and in many cases unhealthily skinny. The low-cut pants and the tight tailoring in the thighs reinforced this. Okay, so here's how clothes get made. I promise this is all connected. When clothes moved more towards ready to wear and this became a more universal system, clothing adopted this idea of sizes. It's a couple of different shapes that in theory will fit everyone, but that's not true. The object that you're meant to wear, clothing, is created using another object, a dress form, that is not you. Then your clothes get made and they get sent to stores where you have to then buy and wear them. So in this whole system, you, the subject, your literal body, you are the last person to have any kind of say in what's happening in this process. It's an object created based on another object that the subject is just supposed to accept. You will eat what I've cooked for you. But that doesn't, first of all, it's really unfair, but also it makes no sense at all, especially if this is what fashion was moving towards. If the trend at the time is these super low cut pants and these tightly tailored thighs, then there's no way for the subject to get what they actually need. It's an object based on another object that's based off of an idea of a woman's body that hardly even exists out in the natural world. At a minimum, our bodies should be in some kind of conversation with the clothes that we're wearing, but this is not a conversation. This is the tyranny of an object dominating the subject. So, Martin and Ray address this problem in different ways. Ray found fashion to be too limiting in general. That's kind of her MO. She chose to free the clothes from the body in this collection. Much like the augmented silhouettes of the past, she proposed new shapes for the body and then created the final result where the dress and the body, the subject and the object, become one new thing together. She freed the clothes and united them with the body. Martin, on the other hand, saw that women were trapped and in servitude to their clothes. By creating objects that were subservient to the subject and uniting the two symbolically, by making the person a dress form, we're to understand that this is a union, he named that problem. And the dress form itself, I don't think it's a stretch to say, is a symbol for feminine oppression. And they broke it. They made the dress form subservient to the woman's body, and they even split the thing. The dress form jackets were often worn open, with the model almost emerging out of it from the system that was holding her body hostage. So as if that isn't enough, they didn't stop. The next step was they made clothes. We've already talked about how Martin has been taking more and more of an interest in couture processes, and for this season he actually went back to school and took a couture draping class from the former atelier head at Givenchy. In the documentary, in his own words, Martin specifies that he wanted originally just to make a couture collection, but when they finished a lot of the dresses, he looked at them and said, this just looks too much like just a regular couture collection. So he looked back through his notes, his pictures, trying to figure out what to do, and he saw the photos of his own couture exercises, these draping lessons that he went through, and he said, this is it right here. We'll show him the process. And that's the signature Margiela move, right? Is we show the process. Just like in showing the process of production in this collection uniquely, he went back and he showed the process of what makes clothes so great. The biggest one so far, all rise. So the women in the collection wore the Stockman jackets and the couture sketches were attached. You may be seated or remain standing if you're just too excited. But for the first time, the Stockman object wouldn't control the woman's body. The woman's body would now be the basis on which the clothes were made. Not an object built on an object, but an object made for its subject. A new kind of couture. It's no coincidence that the Stockman jackets say semi-couture. That's usually where the brand name Stockman would go, but here it's a wordplay. Haute couture means high fashion, semi-couture means half fashion. Margiela is proposing a new philosophy for fashion design. The brilliant Caroline Evans observes in her seminal book, Fashion at the Edge, quote, he recreated the tailor's dummy as a linen waistcoat so that the foundation became underwear, the body became the dress. Today we dive deeply on Fall/Winter 1997. Quick note, the video for this presentation has this lovely PSA at the beginning of it, and it's literally intended to flip your TV or your monitor or your phone on its side, because they film the entire thing vertically. I am mostly going to be flipping that up for you so that you're seeing things right side up, or we might keep it to the side if we need to see something in really close detail. I'm not sure yet. I'm filming it. I'm not editing it yet. So one of the most memorable things about Maison Martin Margiela's work is this super emphasis on presentation. When they could afford to, these runway shows had an extra dash of specialness and exclusivity that was reserved only for the folks who could attend it physically. Fall/Winter 1997 took place in 3 locations at 3 different times around Paris on the same day. The invitation was a tourist promotional map with the dates and times and locations stamped onto it that was shipped out to everyone who was meant to attend. And at 5 a.m. on the morning of the show, the most striking part of the entire presentation left Brussels on a bus headed for Paris. This, friends, was a 35-piece Belgian brass band. They accompanied the models to each of the 3 presentations, playing a slow funeral dirge version of Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? This is maybe the single most bohemian thing I've ever heard of. Remember, folks, when you view the Margiela series on YouTube, you are seeing a very cut down version of each episode. For the full video with tons of extra info and analysis, you got to join the Patreon. You get tons of exclusive content, extended episodes for the Margiela series and for the Rick Owens episodes, and you also get to join the best fashion community on the internet, my private Discord server. Join if you're a real one. This show is a continuation. It's the part 2 after the Spring/Summer 1997 season. We see a lot of themes that are carried over from last season. In the Spring/Summer show, they showed one of the strongest single pieces that the Maison has ever put out in the form of the Stockman jacket, the dummy jacket, the dress form jacket. There's a lot of different names for it. Point is, it was the single biggest all rise that we've had in the entire series so far. The team is going to expand on that topic a little bit more, and we'll cover that when the time is right. So repetition is a difficult topic with the Maison. On the one hand, Martin was a vocal critic of fashion's obsession with newness. We saw this most clearly done in Spring/Summer 1994, which was literally a best of collection. In this season, by repeating a very crucial piece from the prior season and by repeating lots of other pieces from other seasons, we can say that he's making a statement on how things don't have to be new in order to be high quality or interesting. But on the other hand, repeating hit items is a key part of being a successful fashion company. It's a business move. But maybe the best brands are the ones who make the necessary moves to be a functioning, profitable business, but they do so in a way that gives those business moves a purpose. Margiela is repeating successful items so that the stores will buy the designs again and that the customers will buy them from the stores, but they've imbued that repetition with a purpose, criticizing the fashion system's obsession with the new. So yeah, it is a business move, but I think just calling it that is a bit of an oversimplification. An interesting timeline note in all of this is that Martin at this point has definitely made up his mind to go work at the House of Hermes as their creative director for ready to wear, but he hasn't announced this publicly yet. He won't do that for another... This is in March, so it'll be another month. So exciting. And wow, do I have some incredible content coming for the Margiela Hermes work. It is going to be nuts. Okay, all rise. One of the most striking things about this show is the animal fur hats. These were one of the first Margiela images that I personally ever saw, and this drew me into the mystery in a huge way. You may be seated. The hats were made in collaboration with the company Bless. Martin insisted that they be fur wigs made only from reclaimed fur coats at the flea market. The color and the fur type range greatly between the different hats. Maybe one reason for the fur was to draw a distinction between the consumption of leather goods and the consumption of fur. Animals that have been hunted and slaughtered for their fur often are done so exclusively for their fur. Whereas animals used to make leather are often animals that likely would have been slaughtered anyway for the meat industry. For people who are vegan, there is understandably no difference here. But for those of us who are not vegan, this brings to light a pretty crucial difference. That was fast.
Yeah, some group. But they gave me freaking unsweet tea.
This is too sweet!
No.
Slaughtering animals for food, it could be argued, is a necessary thing for life to happen. Slaughtering animals simply for pleasure or on a whim or just because you want something for a coat is, I don't think it's hard to argue, that just feels cruel, right? This can be seen simply in the way that the items are worn. They're wigs. And in her review for the New York Times, Amy Spindler, RIP, points out that this makes her gag, which is an actual quote. There's some things that just kind of shift your perspective when something that's meant to be worn on your back and is part of another formerly living being, it suddenly is worn over your head. It's like touching your face. It's always in the periphery of your vision. It's close to your mouth. Again, as always, Martin is able to make his point while operating inside the confines of the established fashion industry. He executed the idea, no fake fur involved, but he insisted on using reclaimed fur from vintage coats and wraps. Additionally, as always, a point made by the house is executed in a manner that is so visually compelling that it doesn't even need any setup or narrative. It's just a really beautiful image. But our experience of looking at it, as is often the case on this channel, is enriched by closer examination. Shifting gears here, many of the garments that were in this collection still had atelier, what were called instructions, put onto them. Those instructions came in the form of white threads that were sewn on to show where darts or where seams were going to end up being on the final product. Those threads, of course, were left in as the final product for the pieces so that they could demonstrate the process by which they were made, which is a very long-standing theme in the Margiela timeline. Side note, tabby heels are wedges now. The dresses and coats from this collection were offered to buyers in two separate options, black or color. And if the buyers chose the latter, they would come in literally a random color, which to me, that reminds me so much of being in a thrift store and shopping, where if you go in looking for something ultra specific, it's like, oh, I need a navy blazer that fits me really well. Like, you're never gonna end up finding it. But if you enter in with an open mind, you can end up finding something that you would have, one, never found normally, and two, you would have never thought to get for yourself. It's all about this element of surprise. Visually, one of the more interesting pieces in the whole collection was this tear-proof paper patterns that were sewn together to create garments. And they even left on the hooks that would have been attached to individual pattern pieces so they could hang them up for storage in an atelier. Shifting gears to talk more broadly about the collection, many of these looks, they're showing a series of prototypes from the first fitting. Again, the theme of fittings continues with Martin's increased interest in couture processes that he'll get to really flesh out when he starts working at Hermes. But because of the Maison's limited budget and resources, the idea is likely being faked here. The process of fittings is expensive, it's time-consuming, and it's labor-intensive, and it's much more likely that they're only showing the idea of a first fitting rather than this being the true first fitting in a series of fittings and drapings. But again, I don't have documentation to support that one way or the other. That's just my guess. Okay, let's talk about the things that connect this season to the last season, which was part one of the two-part series that are meant to be working together. We'll start really simple. The same jackets and coats that were shown in spring-summer 1997 are shown here as capes with the arms tucked inside. All things considered, this is not my favorite Margiela piece. They're kind of known for doing some pretty brilliant tailoring tricks in order to get their aesthetic to work, where it always looks like something that's kind of just a a casual thing like, oh, we just sort of like, you turn the pants inside out and then they look different when you wear them and stuff. But that's never usually really the case with what Margiela is actually doing. They're doing very advanced tailoring techniques to make simple little styling things actual real structural parts of the garment. And here all they did was just tuck the sleeves in. Now it's a cape. That seems a little bit off kilter for what they've shown in the past, but I don't know, it still looks pretty cool. Other simple things are these variations on the Stockman pieces. Some of them are in pretty wild colorways. Again, this barely counts as continuity because the Maison does repeat designs so much and new colorways are a standard part of the industry even back then. Some of the more nuanced things that actually do bring some solid cohesion to these two collections that we do now have photographs of something that was present last season, but we didn't have any good photography of it. And that is these trademark and logo imbued ribbons that are on the sides of fabric being kept in the final pieces. Typically, if you're buying a full bolt of fabric from a textile manufacturer, there is a ribbon on the outside of the fabric that has trademark information, the company's logo, all this stuff. Those ribbons would never under any circumstances be included in the final product that is sent out to stores. But because Margiela is always wanting to emphasize the process by which clothes are made, that is kept in the final clothing. And especially for this season and the last one, that's the big cohesion moment that brings them together and kind of makes these collections so special, is that they have this really unique, even for Margiela, emphasis on the process by which clothes go from being just loose threads and ideas and colors out in the world to being clothes that you're buying in the store and putting on your body. We also see a detail from last season in this sweater that has this yellow, I'm not really sure what to call that. It looks like a pattern piece maybe? Whatever it is tacked onto the sweater. This is how they showed last season on the Stockman pieces. Some of the Stockman pieces were just plain last season and it was just the jacket, but then there were also elements where they were sort of doing these couture sketches, these draping exercises onto the Stockman jackets. And here we see that theme continued on more normal pieces like knitwear. So these two collections are not just a part one and a part two just because they have similar themes to them. There's also a continuation of the idea. And last season seemed to be the Maison standing up and criticizing the fashion industry for the tyranny of sizing of women's clothes. This season seemed to be more of a celebration of the process that brings us clothing in general. I might be misreading, but unlike the last season, something about this all feels very joyful, which we have seen as a running theme for the entirety of the Maison's history. The process of creating clothing has historically been a very guarded, secret process. Brands, especially luxury brands, have had a vested interest in keeping the consumers away from the creation of the clothing, because their goal is to create as much of a luxurious lifestyle as is possible, and the making of clothes isn't typically a particularly luxurious process. But as always for the Maison, the process is the art. By bringing that process to the forefront and by playing up the unluxuriousness of the process, by leaning into a bohemian aesthetic with the 35-piece street band from Brussels, they're able to achieve something really fresh for Paris in the 1990s. And frankly, this looks pretty fresh today too. Oh, hi, I didn't see you there. My name is Bliss Foster. Welcome back to the Margiela series, where we are exploring every single runway show that Martin Margiela produced at Maison Martin Margiela. Today we find ourselves in spring-summer 1998 and we have so much to cover it's ridiculous. This is the first season where Martin Margiela has begun his work at Hermes. After a lot of negotiations and rumors at the time, he has finally landed there and he has begun work. So Martin is now officially at this point in history, he is splitting his time between his work at his own house and that of Hermes. But for today, we are here. Hey, the Patreon is the only place where you can actually watch the entirety of these episodes. The extended episodes are the only place where we go into the nuances of the clothes themselves, looking at how the story of Margiela is expressed in the sewing and the details and the darts and all of the little cuts and nuances that make these clothes so incredibly special. If you don't know, Patreon is a way for you to give a few bucks a month to the channel so that we can continue to run. You also get a bunch of special stuff if you sign up. Back to it. Huge news! Martin Margiela reached out to Grandma Ray Kawakubo and asked her if she wanted to do a joint showing for this Paris Fashion Week, And she agreed. Grandma Ray and Marty have had a very extensive relationship up to this point, and I feel like it's important to highlight what that relationship is. So welcome to the episode within an episode titled Martin Margiela, Rei Kawakubo's oldest son. First, the facts. Rei Kawakubo was one of the founders of the deconstruction movement in fashion. The brand started in 1969 and they incorporated in 1973. Comme des Garçons was successful in Japan, so they started showing in Paris in 1981. But Martin Margiela had graduated from the Royal Academy in Antwerp, Belgium just 2 years prior in 1979. When Comme des Garçons was showing in Paris, Martin Margiela was in Paris working at Jean Paul Gaultier. The tradition of deconstruction in Paris fashion would be continued by Martin Margiela and then later by his friends in the Antwerp Six. But here, okay, so that's the facts. Here's the really crazy stuff. In 1984, the first Comme des Garçons store opened in Belgium. You know who opened it? Jenny Meerens, who's the co-founder of Maison Martin Margiela. It's Martin's business partner and one of his early supporters right after he got out of school. And in fact, Jenny went for a meeting with Rei Kawakubo in Tokyo right after she opened the store, and she wore head to toe Martin Margiela's work. And she asked Rei Kawakubo at the end of the meeting, "Do you like my outfit?" And Ray said that she liked her shoes and bought a pair off of her. Jenny then rushed to a telephone and called Martin in the middle of the night and said, "I sold your shoes to Rei Kawakubo." This, by the way, was not a pair of tabbies. It was part of a collection that he did in the mid-80s that helped him to win the Golden Thimble Award. And throughout his career at the Maison showing in Paris, Rei Kawakubo would end up coming to a lot of Martin's shows. She clearly liked what he was doing. Finally, last point, 2 seasons ago in spring-summer 1997, Rei Kawakubo and Martin Margiela covered very similar topics. I'm not aware of any planning or communication that they had regarding this, but both the Lumps and Bumps collection and the Stockman collection were very similar. Both of them dealt with the relationship that women's bodies have to the clothes that they're wearing. And here we are. For 14 years, Rei Kawakubo and Martin Margiela have been orbiting each other, and we finally see them connect in this show. How is there not an internationally recognized holiday to commemorate this? Just so there's not any confusion, Rei Kawakubo and Martin Margiela did not design anything about each other's collection. This was not a collab in any sense. It was mostly just a business decision to share a space for their presentation. But designers don't typically do that unless they have a lot of respect for each other's work and feel like it would be mutually beneficial for the two collections to be shown in the same space, even if they're not working on each other's collections. Both presentations will be boosted by the presence of the other. Thank you for joining me for this episode within an episode. Let's now get back to the episode. Spring-summer 1998 was held at the Conciergerie. How do we say it?
Conciergerie.
Spring 98 was held at the Conciergerie, which is the place where Marie Antoinette and other royals were held to await execution during the French Revolution. It is just a stone's throw away from the Louvre in the first arrondissement. This is the first Martin Margiela show that is shown in the first arrondissement. We remember that throughout their history, they have taken delight in not showing where everyone else was showing. It's standard at that time for all of the brands in Paris Fashion Week to show at these big tents that are set up near the Louvre. All of Paris Fashion Week, for the most part, happens in one place. But Martin and his team have taken delight in showing in places where normal people typically are, like a playground or a post office or circus grounds. Why are they showing in the first arrondissement now? I honestly have no idea. To be fair, they're not showing exactly where everyone else is. They're technically across the river. This might have had something to do with the joint showing with Grandma Ray. It might also just be the Maison embracing their own legitimacy. They're a major player in Paris Fashion Week now, and there's nothing wrong with them making that clear. Folks, all rise. This is the flat show. All garments presented here may be laid completely flat on the ground. The team used the pattern pieces from the previous season as the base for this concept. We remember that in the last season there were a number of pieces that were made of literal paper pattern pieces that had been joined together. The self-imposed constraint of flatness made for some incredible looking clothes and a few innovations that I'm honestly surprised haven't been adopted by more fast fashion companies now. You may be seated. It feels so good to do these all rises with like the major hallmarks of the house, doesn't it? This is great. This is also the first season where the brand started doing their signature accordion style lookbooks. This accordion lookbook is not from Spring 98, but it gives you a good idea of what they actually looked like. Okay, so the way that this show was actually executed is fairly complicated, and we don't have any video footage of the actual show happening. The footage for this season is just the projection, what was shown up on the wall to the people who showed up at the presentation itself. But that presentation was rather complex, so in order to tell you about it, I'm just gonna read directly from the Women's Collections book, which has become the Bible for making this series possible. It's like I could rephrase it, but let's just go ahead and read it straight from the horse's mouth. I've got 3 paragraphs for you and some images so that we can kind of get an idea of what we're looking at. At the location, the crowd first moved towards a corner with the Margiela installation, which was a circle marked by 5 16-foot-high towers covered in white cotton, which surrounded a 6th identical tower in the center. The 5 towers were identified by a letter or number that corresponded with guests' invitations. As in all of Margiela's shows, there was no specific floor plan. Viewers positioned themselves in front of one of the towers, standing up or seated. And so began the show. It has quotes, I don't know. 20 men of various ages dressed in white lab coats flowed into the room, pulling 5 racks covered with a piece of white cotton fabric. They separated into 5 groups, one in front of each tower. The lights grew dim. A film was projected that presented the first of 10 sequences, illustrating the 10 themes of the collection. Each sequence was accompanied by a different piece of music, from Yoko Ono to a classical song with Indian music in between, all featuring a woman's piercing voice. It was preceded by an explanatory text in French, English, and Japanese. Amid the applause of the crowd, 4 men from each group presented the clothing on hangers to the audience as in a clothing store. For the finale, at the foot of each tower, a man in a white lab coat went up to a chair on which a pot of red paint had been placed. He climbed on top and painted "End" on the white cotton fabric in a different language for each tower. He then stepped down, took off his coat, threw it on the floor, and went back to join the other men who had left the room with the racks. Fin. Pieces of this could possibly be a continuation of the Dolls wardrobe stuff that started in fall '94. Margiela is on record saying that he got massive inspiration from making clothes for his dolls as a child, so it stands to reason that he would have likely had paper dolls as well, the clothes of which would have been certainly flat. We also see from the In His Own Words documentary that Martin Margiela was pretty crafty as a kid, very arts and crafts oriented, and he had these paintings of different people and he would swap out their clothing and maybe their hair by using different paper cutouts and superimposing them on top of the painting. Here we can see him doing that with his grandma, which is mega wholesome. It could also just be as simple as they say it in the book, that this is all just based off of the pattern pieces from the previous season. Kind of a reminder to the wearer of where the clothes and the design come from, that it's not just a piece that poofed into existence, that it's the result of a lot of different labor and engineering and cutting and measuring and lots of people being involved. The reason that the shirts and other items from this season are able to lay flat in the first place is because they moved the entire neck hole onto the front panel of the shirt. Let me show you, hang on. Okay, so the shirt that I'm wearing and on this shirt, the neck hole is divided between the front panel and the back panel of the shirt. You see? There's a shoulder seam right there. And the neck hole is split. Half of it's on the back and half of it's on the front. So by moving the neck hole entirely onto the front of the piece, that then allows it to lay totally flat. Whereas with this, if we throw it onto a table, it can't ever be really flat because the neck hole is split between these 2 different pattern pieces. But if you move it onto the front, then it happily lays flat. Another interesting note here is that, like last season, they kept the vertical camera work for this one. So if you're taking notes on this, you can go ahead and jot down that Martin Margiela invented TikTok. Aha. Finally, because of a very brief interview with ID Magazine, we learned 2 important things. One is that the Maison had a 19-member team at the time. The second thing we learned is that their distinctive style of doing interviews has officially started. We know from the We Margiela documentary that Patrick Scallon was their communications director and that he sort of helped Martin to figure out the way in which they were going to do these interviews. Everyone, of course, wanted to just speak directly with Martin, but Martin was not cool with that, and so they started doing interviews via fax. Patrick would take those questions, take them to Martin, kind of hash them out with him, and then eventually Patrick landed on a rhythm by which he could respond to these things, knowing confidently that he was speaking in Martin's voice. But the idea from the interviewer's perspective was that they were speaking to the entire Maison. Instead of answering with I, they would answer with we. We have so much more to cover with the specifics of these clothes, and if you want to see the extended episode for this one and for tons of other Margiela episodes, including a exclusive Margiela episode, it's all on the Patreon. You can click the link that's on the screen right now. Click that link or the link that is always in the description of every single video. It's just patreon.com/blissfoster. The support would mean a ton to me. This is my full-time job. It's my only source of income. And you get to watch all these episodes and know that they are proudly brought to you by you. Today we find ourselves in fall-winter 1998. This is part 2 of the flat collection. We've seen them do a part 1 and a part 2 for a previous set of seasons in the spring and fall of 1997 with the Stockman dummy collections. This one is a continuation of the themes that were laid out last season in spring-summer 1998. This is a really unusual show. I realize that I say that a lot. It's really true with this one. This show took place only one day after Martin's first presentation with the House of Hermes. He's been working there since last season, but this is the first time that he has shown as the creative director for the ready-to-wear line at Hermes. Again, we have some incredible content for that on the way, but for now we are here in this show, and it's important that we realize that Martin is, for the first time in his career, splitting his time between full-time work at Hermes and full-time work at his own house. There's some loose documentation that implies that Martin was helping to fulfill contract work while he was the assistant for Jean-Paul Gaultier, so he is used to having to change his vision to suit the needs of different houses, but this is the first time where he is having to do that full-time and fully encapsulate both houses. And I think that was a little bit difficult for him to pick up on at first. Originally, Martin didn't even want to work for Hermes. When they reached out to him at first, he didn't like the idea at all. His co-founder, Jenny Meerens, was actually the one that pushed him to take the meeting with Hermes and sort of encouraged him to take that position. And because he is now probably just really stressed trying to split his time, Jenny understood that he felt a little bit overwhelmed and so helped out a lot with the staging and the presentation of this collection at the Maison. Fall-winter 1998 became a very memorable show in the Maison's history thanks to their 3 collaborators for the actual presentation itself. And that was the legendary photographer Mark Borthwick, British stylist Jane Howe, and art researcher and writer Sidney Picasso. Just to be upfront with everybody, we're going to be very light on the clothes this season. The actual garments themselves are largely a rehash of stuff that the Maison has done previously and that we've covered in a whole lot of detail. There's a few new garments, but not many. The thing that makes this show so memorable is the artfulness of the presentation itself. And since the extended episodes, the whole purpose of the extended episodes for the Patreon supporters is that we go into super minute detail about the clothes themselves and how the themes are changing in the actual stitches and the darts, that's not going to be one for this season. I guess I could find a way to sort of stretch that out and force there to be a Patreon extended episode, but I feel like that would be a little bit dishonest. So for this one, I am just not doing an extended episode. This is all of the content that there is for fall-winter 1998. Okay, so there is a piece of information that I have come across since I began this series on Margiela that has pretty fundamentally changed my outlook on the house. Here's the deal. For a number of years when the brand started out, the name of the brand itself was Martin Margiela. So like on the Paris Fashion Week schedule, it would read like this: Martin Margiela, fall winter 1992. That was pretty bizarre to me because I had only ever heard the house referred to as Maison Martin Margiela and then eventually getting changed under Galliano to Maison Margiela. We learned from the We Margiela documentary from Patrick Scallon, who was the communications director for the house, set up a dichotomy between the two different names, Martin Margiela and Maison Martin Margiela. The first was to delineate the projects, usually just runway show presentations, that were there under the creative direction of Martin. Maison Martin Margiela was to specify separate events and exhibitions and projects that were by the entire team. It was more about the work of the team as a whole rather than just of the creative direction of Martin. An example of a Maison Martin Margiela project early on was the bacteria exhibit that happened in the Netherlands. There is also some crazy content coming about that. You should be so excited. So since Martin was so incredibly busy getting his footing at Hermes, this was actually shown on the presentation invites as Maison Martin Margiela. Now, eventually the house did switch to just being Maison Martin Margiela. Maybe that's because the ethos of the entire team working together to accomplish things became much more important and prevalent in their process. Maybe it's because that was important in the process all along and they just realized it and wanted to acknowledge it. This project here, because it is a product of the Maison, is not better or worse. I think we're kind of past the point of using overly simple value assessments for these kinds of things, but it is noticeably different, and we shall see how. Okay. So we need to cover a really crucial element of the Maison's work here in order to understand how this show is so different. I promise this is all relevant. It's not going to feel like it at first. Hang with me. Fashion is an art form that functions really differently than any other. With painting, things are, it's art, so it's still complex, but it's much more simple. If you're in a museum looking at an original painting, you are here, the painting is there, the painting is communicating with you, affecting you in whatever way it will, and then you go out into the world and maybe your life has changed changed by what you've seen, but there's just still this thing here and you here. Fashion is created by a designer or a team of designers. It is then created by a separate group of people. It then goes out into stores where you can see it contextualized in lots of different ways. And then it is purchased by a person and incorporated into their life. The element of personal style adds this whole other separate, confusing element to fashion that makes it a very unique art form. So the reason that this show here, Fall Winter 1998, is so different is because they added in yet another conflicting, crazy, unpredictable element to the way that fashion comes to the public. So we have a group of designers designing the collection, produced by a separate group of people, given to 3 artists who decided to present it in some bizarre extra thing. It's then sent to stores and then bought by people. 5 elements instead of 4. So big deal, right? Like they got some collaborators to help them with the presentation. That's not unusual. Well, I think the reason that this becomes so important is because it really exemplifies the separation between Martin Margiela and Maison Martin Margiela and why those two things had to become one entity. Martin, as an artist and fashion designer, more leaned on his ability to lead other people into a vision that they could then interpret. Really a game of telephone almost is maybe a way of thinking about it. And there is a precedent for this in art. There are tons of contemporary artists who have carried this out, like Jeff Koons and Ai Weiwei, and even Andy Warhol, where the instructions are given out and they're able to be executed by other people. And really, this has been something that has existed in art from the very beginning. I mean, spoiler alert, Michelangelo didn't do this by himself. And there's even good precedent for this in other Margiela collections. In Spring/Summer 1993, the Black and White show, they purchased clothes from a closing theater company in Paris and then overdyed those garments using one technique with one shot. And then they just released the collection, whatever it was. They set up the process, allowed it to be executed, and used what they had. Another example in the Salvation Army show where their technique for creating the collection resulted in some of the garments being shrunk so much that they couldn't fit them onto adults, so they had to incorporate children into the show. But here in this show, they really exemplified that process. As always, they are bringing you the process and helping you to understand the clothes better by understanding how all of this art comes to be. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 contributors to this show. Sidney Picasso is the daughter-in-law of Pablo Picasso, who is an art researcher and writer. She created a continuous ribbon that was apparently extremely long and had text written on it, as well as a pamphlet that was handed out to people, probably in the form of show notes about the show itself and about the Maison at large. As people entered into the venue space, the ribbon was cut and tied around everyone's wrists individually, kind of like the way they do for concerts. Mark Borthwick created a short film for the presentation. This mostly features abstract stuff involving chairs and the models in various states of dress and undress. The more important part to me, though, is when we see 3 of the models wearing the clothes and talking simultaneously. For our copy of this film, we can't hear exactly what they're saying, but this is a pretty revolutionary repositioning of the role of model. Usually, the model is silent. So back then it was fairly similar. There were a few things that were different. It was much more standard, especially at Paris Fashion Week, for models to be kind of like cutesy and sashaying and doing cute little things or smoking cigarettes. But even at that time when the idea was that it's like, oh, her personality can shine through so much more, I don't feel like that's really what was happening. They were telling the models backstage, look charming, be pretty, act cute, which of course a forced cuteness does not give us any more insight into who the model is in the first place. It's just exactly that, it's a forced cuteness. But here we're seeing those models talking simultaneously, wearing the collection, and just being themselves. And the Maison has had an interesting conflict as far as the use of their models is concerned. From some models literally falling down during presentations, to the inclusion of neighborhood kids during presentations, to couples walking the runway together unexpectedly or planned, I'm not really sure, to sometimes entire families that ended up having to walk the runway together because a kid was just being fussy backstage and needed his mom. The personalities of models has always been a priority for the Maison, while still maintaining this contradictory stance that the clothes should speak for themselves and that the models are so unimportant that they should often be masked. I'm not really sure how to explain that contradiction in a way that makes sense, but it is a tension that has become a hallmark of the house. And here in this collection, Mark allows the personality of the models to take precedent by recording them speaking and living, warts and all. As is often the case for Margiela's work, this emphasizes and praises the reality of how women are in the real world. The beauty of these women reminds us of the beauty of the women in our own lives. Last contributor, Jane Howe. Jane Howe is a stylist, and the reason that this show is so recognizable is because of her work. She produced these nightmare fuel marionettes that modeled the collection at the show itself. After Mark's short film had ended, a walkway dropped down from the ceiling and 15 life-size marionettes emerged wearing the pieces from the collection, controlled by two puppeteers wearing all black. Lately, the Maison has started experimenting more and more with the removal of models altogether, and this is an extension of that idea. We remember that in part one of the flat collection, spring-summer 1998, the actual presentation itself just had men holding up hangers holding the clothes, which is the way that it would be in a store, right? Here with the marionettes, we see them as if they're on store mannequins that are also somehow nightmarishly able to walk around. We do, unfortunately, only see a few small developments with the clothes in this collection. We see a precursor to one of the more famous Margiela pieces ever that we'll see many seasons later in this shirt jacket thing here. We also see some very clever flips on the garments that were established in part one of the flat collection, which are referred to as the envelope items. In my opinion, the most iconic piece that is added to the Margiela canon in this season is the coin purse glove bag. This is a piece that would end up being reissued for the H&M collaboration many years later. Every 5 years, after 10 shows, Martin Margiela would take a step back and then do a retrospective show to review the last 10 shows that he's done. We find ourselves here in the 20th show that Martin had done, so this is now his second retrospective show. I take time in this series every 10 episodes to also do a retrospective to kind of look back at where we've been in the last 10 episodes. So if this is the first episode that you've seen, this is a great place to start. This is kind of the mid-period of Margiela's work. This is where a lot of the stuff that we know him for came about. I should also let you know that this Runway show on its own was pretty cool. It was a retrospective show, but there is a lot to talk about in the Runway show itself. So the way that we have this divided up is that the extended episode of this one will be covering the actual Runway show itself. The main public episode that you're watching here right now, this is just gonna be the retrospective where we look back at the last 10 shows. So if you wanna watch the full thing, you should definitely join the Patreon. We have extended episodes for most of the Margiela series and for a bunch of Rick Owens episodes and other things. Go join that Patreon, please. Okay, so the Maison has a great habit of doing things that are both good for the business and also fit very seamlessly into the world building that they've already established for the brand. This season is no exception. There's a really cynical way of looking at this and saying like, oh yeah, of course you want to do a retrospective show because that's going to make you more money. You just get to repeat the designs and everyone buys a bunch of them. But I do think that that's a little bit unfair. Now, the full story here is that Martin's time is rather limited at this point because he started up as the ready-to-wear creative director for Hermes, and that is soaking up a lot of his time. And so there is less time on the table to actually get things done, but they've already set this precedent well before he started at Hermes and had his time limited, where they, after 10 shows, did another retrospective show. This is the second retrospective show. So there is precedent for it, but also Margiela is known generally for delivering such high quality stuff to the runway every season. Anytime you look at someone who is talking about the overall body of work from Martin, they very regularly talk about how more than many other designers, he was coming in every season with a huge new idea. And if you look back at the actual runway reviews for those seasons, at the time that they were coming out, many of them, they didn't get it. At least not in the way that we get it now when we get to look back at the full body of work. And so it does make sense that if you're introducing such new concepts every single season and you're totally reinventing yourself and you're doing this performance art thing along with it and all this stuff, that there would need to be a time where you're able to step back and say, let's kind of review what we've seen. And there absolutely have been some things that the Maison has done that have purely been business decisions. They did a See Now, Buy Now runway presentation in 1994. Gosh. That was such a loud car. And there definitely have been some business decisions that are meant to further the bottom line, like they did a See Now, Buy Now presentation in fall of '94. They introduced a basics and underwear line. The Maison is a very artful designer brand, but at the same time, they're also a business and they do have to pay their bills. But in this case, I don't think it's a cash grab. I think a best of collection is very warranted here. Let's talk about some major themes and motifs that we've seen over the last 10 collections. There has been a big increase in the performance art element of these runway shows. We've had a number of huge moments like this, including a show that happened at 3 different locations around Paris where they bust in a bohemian Belgian street band. We had massive, terrifying, life-size marionettes. We had a runway show at the circus. We even had a show where the audience loaded up into a theater where they thought they were just seeing a short film from the previous season, and then suddenly the models stood up in the audience already wearing the collection and took to the stage. Another big theme that started up with these shows is the doll's wardrobe clothes. This has become one of the most distinctive parts of the Maison's history and is a huge part of Martin's own life. Martin enjoyed playing with dolls as a kid and often enjoyed dressing them up and making clothes for them. He was a very arts and crafts kind of kid. We have him on record talking about how the proportions of dolls' clothes gives them a really unique look and shape that you don't often see in regular full-size people clothes. So the solution that he came up with was to scale up those clothes proportionally to life size. Because if you look really closely at, say, Barbie doll clothes, it's meant to give the impression of, say, a jacket, but the lapels of the thing are much, much bigger proportionally than they would be on a regular blazer. So while we would say just like, oh yeah, these are Barbie jeans, they're really only similar to actual jeans in a passing look. But we can see that the proportions here are carried over with very high fidelity. You can even see that the threads are way, way bigger than they normally would be here. Another major theme is the Replica Line. The Maison has always been very inspired by vintage garments. In the first 10 shows that they did, they were much more focused on historic clothing and making direct references to that. In this collection of shows, we see much more of an emphasis on what at the time in the 90s was considered vintage clothing. So not so much stuff from 200 years ago, more stuff from 50 years ago. The Replica Line is really special because they would take these garments that they had found in different places around the world, usually in Europe, and they would get their factories to recreate those garments as truly as they possibly could. So through the Maison, then, you could buy a vintage piece that was brand new. And that's one of those ideas that is so simple that it's really difficult for it to click with, I'll speak for myself, it was very difficult for it to click with me as to how special that truly was. Prior to the Maison, there was no one who was honoring the lineage of clothes, where these designs were coming from, in a way that they would say, this is not our garment, this is another person's garment, we don't even know who made it really, but this is such a special piece that we want to honor it by giving you a brand new version of it. Because the reality is that all designers go to flea markets and vintage stores and buy historic clothes and visit museums so that they can pull inspiration from those garments and in some cases literally recreate them. But no one was coming out and revealing that part of the process to the public in such a blatant way. And that's been a theme for the Maison for the entirety of their history. The numbering system. This is a part of the Maison's history that did not come about all at once. We now know this tag to be the thing that, I mean, for me, this is what most visually defines the work of Margiela. Well, maybe a tie between this and the tabby boot. So this in its final form, the full numbering system, did not come about all at once. Originally in fall/winter 1994, they divided their offerings into 6 groups. Looks from former collections, replicas of old garments, existing garments with exaggerated proportions, artisanal clothes and accessories, basics and undergarments, and linings of garments that are used as the garment itself. And so that idea of having different categories of offerings was something that they kicked around for a few seasons, and then a couple of seasons ago, we have the first garment that we can see actually has this final tag that we know and love today. A big change in the Maison that's happened over the course of these last 10 shows is the issue of wearability. When the Maison did their first show in the spring '89 season, they weren't able to fill orders for any of the clothes that they were showing. All they were able to take orders from buyers for were the tabby boots. As they continued, they started to be able to take orders for some of the clothes, but a lot of the stuff was so conceptual that it would have been, I imagine, difficult to work into someone's wardrobe. So in order to please their buyers, they're now trying to find a balance between making this a sellable piece of product and keeping the artfulness that's made them so famous. And I think they've done that pretty successfully. This runway show, spring/summer 1999, features a lot of pieces that are substantially more wearable versions of what they've shown in the past. I talk a lot about the Margiela layering technique, and that's a way of getting lots of different layers, but keeping everything very close to the wearer's body. And in this collection of 10 shows that we're looking at today, they've kept that layering technique around, but they've honed it in so it feels much more wearable to someone who's looking to just sell something. Another point, in these last 10 shows, we've seen a continuation of the tension between showing the model and not showing the model. One of the most iconic things about Margiela is those legendary masks, and one of the reasons why those were used was to take emphasis away from the model, the person wearing the thing, any kind of cult of personality around supermodels and stuff, and just say that the clothes are what truly matter here. For the record, that is an oversimplification of why Margiela used masks, but we will stick with that for now. So some Some shows that are examples of them taking emphasis off the model to focus us on the clothes would be the marionettes. The masks, of course, see a lot of usage in these past 10 shows. Another example is the total absence of models a few seasons ago where sales clerks would hold up the different looks. But on the other hand, and this is where the tension comes in, there's a lot of examples of the Maison emphasizing the women who were wearing those clothes and giving us deeply personal moments with those women. Within that same marionette show, we also had a short film of women wearing the collection and talking in a very unfiltered way. It's not just them being cute and pretty, it's the Maison showing these women, warts and all, just exactly how they are. And in that way, I think, kind of praising who they really are. And especially if you look through the videos for this collection of shows, there's just many times where they can't help but keep in these moments that are very personable and very sweet and very cute and just put a lot of emphasis on these women just being the way that they are. And I say the word tension here very purposefully instead of the word contradiction. I think if we call this a contradiction, it sort of gives us leave to put it aside and say, okay, well, that's just sloppy art. We're not going to look at that element of this anymore. But what I'd rather us do is over the next 10 shows to really look at that tension and see if we can pull anything out of it that's more simple than just, are you emphasizing the models or are you emphasizing the clothes? When good art has tension like that, it's important to pay attention to that tension and see what you can learn from looking at the way those points conflict with each other. So we'll keep an eye on that in future shows and see what we can come up with. We are halfway done with this series. We have done 20 shows and we have 20 more to go. We find ourselves today in fall/winter 1999. We're back to doing showrooms, folks. This is a showroom in the 18th arrondissement, and instead of a standard invitation, guests received a fax that had all of the details they needed to get there. It did not take place on a single day, but over the course of a number of different days. For a single season presentation from a brand, this was actually a pretty long time. They had it open for 15 days. Invited guests would make appointments with the Maison and then come at their appointed time into a room that had been painted all white with 3 rows of movie seats and a screen. Outside, pasted on the door, was the first few scenes of the film's presentation. Thigh-high knitted socks and a model wearing them. Other stills from the film were also printed out and put around the showroom for presentation. Kind of like movie posters. The film, which was made by Marina Faust, who is a long-standing photographer with the Maison, the film was made by Marina and it was shot in the same screening room that the guests were actually watching the film in. It featured the iconic Christina DeConnick and Paula Girardi. The video's soundtrack was Timmy Thomas's Why Can't We Live Together, which most people know because it was the sample for the beat for Drake's Hotline Bling. Personally, I like the original a lot more. As guests arrived, they were served popcorn and little cups of red wine to enjoy while they were watching. Let's actually take a moment, because we haven't done this in many episodes. Let's take a moment to talk about the red wine. It's a siren. Lovely. So red wine was upending a lot of conventions in Paris fashion. It would have been much more normal for champagne to be served or really nice hors d'oeuvres to be served. They were playing in a lot still into this kind of 80s and 70s idea of ultra luxury when people were showing up to these shows. So by serving the red wine in these little like plastic cups, that was again bringing Margiela back to the lives of regular women. So to viewers of this series, this shouldn't be anything new. They've upended a lot of Paris fashion conventions by letting children make their runway invitations, by hosting the shows in really unconventional locations, and by not allocating assigned seating to people who were more important. Here in the present, that might not seem like a super revolutionary thing, but at the time, these were conventions that were so customary to Paris fashion that it was making people mad that they were doing stuff like this. And I don't know if we should look at those things as them being aggressive against the industry or trying to like parody what was already happening. I think it was more them saying like, this is how we as a company celebrate the completion of a new show. Celebrate with us. It more leaned into a sincerity rather than a rebellion. And this season, they managed to turn that seasonal celebration into an accessory. All rise. In French wine culture, when a particularly nice vintage was opened, the cork would be hung sideways around the neck of the bottle between 2 metal prongs on a chain to display its make, its year, and the grapes that went into its creation. These prongs on a chain, or pique-bouchon, became the basis of a necklace offered this season. You may be seated. And to honor the coming of this new style of cork necklace, I wore my original cork necklace that was used in one of their first shows. This was a gift that was given to me by a Margiela collector. I tried to give it back like 5 separate times and he insisted, so here I am with this, and it's like my favorite thing that I own now. The cork for this season was inscribed in French with the words, "Place the cork from the first bottle of wine you drink in the year 2000 here." The year 2000 was approaching and the Maison wanted to mark the occasion of this here, the final season of the 20th century. It is important to note that the fashion calendar is pitched forward, so technically they will do one more show in 1999, but as far as the fashion calendar is concerned, this is the last one. But the sentiment here is that these clothes, these accessories, this collection is meant to be the collection that you will wear with you at the turn of the new millennium. The Maison, as always, is very optimistic about the future, and they encourage you to wear that optimism around your neck. And they're re-upping the same symbol that they've held for a while. The original cork necklace, this one is from fall-winter 1989, and the recurring theme with that kind of cements yet again the Maison repeating itself even as we go into a new millennium. The symbol of the cork necklace is such a great encapsulation of the Maison's celebratory side. It's a nice encapsulation of the Maison overall. This is a really unusual season because there are not as many photographs of this one as there would be for other shows that are before or after it. That was of course a huge problem when I first started this series. There were some seasons that had very, very little imagery, so we're just like then, we're working with what we have. Some other garments this season include dress linings as dresses, as seen in these lookbook images. Dress linings as dresses are a staple of the Maison, and it's been seen as a motif in many other seasons. Using this concept here, using the cork motif again here, these are important because we just got off of the 10-year retrospective show. Every 5 years, the Maison does a retrospective of the last 10 seasons that they've done. 5 years, 10 seasons. And I imagine that many fashion critics and fans of the Maison were wondering if after a 10-year period, they would then switch and kind of start afresh with a totally new set of symbols. The Maison is assuring them with these things here that they are sticking to their roots and doing what they've always done, and that they are going to slowly build on the world that they've already established. That slow building can be seen as the lining dresses came with necklaces of the same material attached to the back of the dress this season. An antique silver color was painted onto jeans this season, as well as tabbies and jackets as well. A really cool evolution that we saw this season was these thigh-high socks with rubberized holes at the bottom that allowed them to be worn over these platform mules and minimalist jeans that were also released that season. A great recurring thing that Martin would incorporate into his work is these garments that were extremely unique and needed to be paired with other garments in order to create a full look. Unlike a lot of other fashion houses that would pair together items based on their color palette or just their cut, the Maison was releasing a lot of pieces that functionally needed to fit together over one another so that you could have this really distinct, unique look to them. A megazord, if you will. Another very cool item was this large retro brown corduroy men's vest, which was complete with a collar and a shirt front to cover the chest that was layered over a dress. The full impact of this season can be felt though through the single most iconic piece that they released this season. Oh my gosh, are we doing 2? Yes, we are. All rise! Let's fucking go! It's the Duvet Coat, y'all. In taking everyday objects and transforming them into garments, we here see maybe the best example that the Maison ever did, a down comforter that has been turned into a winter coat. You may be seated or stand for the rest of your life in honor of this, the most excellentest of fashion history items. Words are so hard. Let's talk about how they made this. 2 long detachable sleeves were inserted with zippers into an actual comforter. They didn't make a new comforter for the creation of this piece. In fact, the tag from the Italian manufacturer, Featherlight, was still found on the garment. The edges of the comforter coat were piped with brown cords made of cotton. And better yet, they even created duvet covers for this coat. In the film presentation, you can even see two employees in white coats swapping out the different duvets for the coat one by one. One of them was even created from a typical floral sheet from the 1970s that was overdyed. And again, that is a callback to the lives of regular people. There's another one that was made from old khaki army blankets. These two fabric duvets even had the same string of buttons that were used to secure them to the coat the way that duvet covers are secured to comforters. There was also this incredible one that was made of a plastic PVC bag, harkening back to the packaging that bedding comes in traditionally when you buy it from the store. And that's a motif that we've seen repeated since spring summer 1990 when we started doing the clothing bag that you would get back from the cleaners as a part of the final outfits that they would put on the runway. I would say it is definitely a callback in that they are continuing to expand the world that they've already developed. And it also had the added benefit of making the coat waterproof. This coat made such a huge splash when it came out that Bill Cunningham, who is the legendary street style photographer for the New York Times, Bill Cunningham did an entire spread of all of the examples that he saw around New York City of women wearing this incredible coat. And besides being a fashion street style photographer, Bill Cunningham had an encyclopedic knowledge of fashion. If Bill was into it, they had truly hit on something special, but obviously you don't need me to tell you that. The video closes with a shot of a closed fist wearing long black leather gloves. The model opens her hand to reveal two things. First, a tabby mitten with individual thumb and index finger pockets dividing the hands into 3 parts. Second, a small piece of paper from fortune cookies that read, "You will be fortunate in everything you put your hands to." Beautiful, iconic, incredible season this time. Fall/winter 1999 was a massive point for the Maison. We find ourselves in spring/summer 2000. It is time for a big gear shift. This is the first show of the new millennium according to the fashion calendar. This show actually took place on October 7th, 1999. We're going to see a great example here of how the Maison does a massive change while still keeping to the core codes and spirit of the house. This is a huge question in contemporary fashion. How do you make a big aesthetic change without just making it seem like you are bending towards trend? In the case of Margiela, the solution there was to turn away from trend. Let us take a closer look. Also, if you actually want to be seeing the full episodes in this series and support the channel, go join the Patreon. Pause the video now, go join the Patreon and return so that you can actually watch the full episode. This channel and these episodes specifically take an enormous amount of work, and this is my only source of income. So please support the content you love. This show took place in the 16th arrondissement in a rugby stadium. It didn't actually take place in the rugby playing part of the stadium. It was in an enclosed room, but a rugby stadium all the same. Like many shows before, the Maison is focusing on places that do not have any direct tie to fashion and are focused more on the places and the people that you would see in normal life in order to highlight the beauty and the mystery of real life. As with many of these runway shows, the live presentation is prioritized over everything else. It's worth us pausing here and talking about how this runway show was actually set up because it is very, very different than any other show I've ever seen. So the audience entered into a dark room and took whatever seat that they could find. There was no assigned seating, as there always isn't any assigned seating. They took their seats around large banquet-style tables with large white tablecloths over them. There were chairs that were lined up around the tables except for a single place which was missing a chair. Okay, so there's 20 tables total in 4 rows of 5 tables each. 20 tables total. Once everyone was seated, staff members came out in the white lab coats to the empty place at the tables where there were no chairs and pulled out a step stool that went up to the top of the table. The employees also threw 2 small objects onto each table and then they left the room. The 2 tiny objects were the ripped off stiletto heels from pairs of pumps. 1 pair for each table. In the darkness, 20 models came out. Each of them went to a specific table, walked up the little staircase, and then a singular light shone down, 1 on each table. And the models walked around in the little bit of space that they had and showed their fit to that table for 25 seconds. Then the lights would go out, the models would walk back down in the darkness, go to the next table, walk back up, then the lights come back on. They continued to do this so that every model eventually would make it to each table. Okay, so what are they doing here? Margiela has always prioritized the clothes over everything else. It's also one of the reasons, I'm saying one for all of these because these were very multifaceted symbols that were because of and meant a lot of different things, but it is also one of the reasons why many of the models would often be wearing these masks that cover their faces. Everything was meant to be pointing towards the clothes. All the answers you need are in the clothes and the presentation. This format allowed them to put further emphasis on the clothes in a way that they hadn't before. In a typical runway show where models are just walking down a catwalk and posing and then walking back off stage, the models each, and the looks more specifically, are part of a big, larger thing. A runway show. But these bite-sized pieces with very little walking and certainly no formal runway allows each of the viewers at each of the tables to take in the outfits individually without all of the distracting baggage of a typical runway presentation. You're no longer looking at these clothes as part of a collection and a runway show more broadly. You're looking at them as individual ensembles. Kat Debo also observes that this heightens the audience's attention. You're sitting at a table with other people, probably strangers, and the handful of you are looking together at a real person who is standing on a table, and that person is just a few feet from you. It's a setup where if you walked in feeling kind of drowsy, this would wake you up. Okay, so let's take some time to look at the biggest single change that they made this season as far as the clothes are concerned, and that is a massively oversized silhouette. There's a precedent for this that goes all the way back to the Bedrock Spring-Summer 1990 show where they used a mega oversized men's undershirt tank top thing and then put that under a form-fitting mesh top. The way that the tank top gets rumpled up under the form-fitting mesh top achieves this Greek goddess statue effect. And we see this also with the doll's wardrobe pieces, which were, by their nature, also very oversized. Despite these few precedents that are kind of sprinkled in throughout the Maison's legacy so far, they are generally known for very form-fitting silhouettes. I mean, I've talked a billion times so far in this series about the Margiela layering technique, and that just refers to many different garments, multiple garments that are all fitting to the body in a way that is, despite how many articles of clothing are on them, still very close to the body. High armholes, stuff like that. But with this show, they begin to formally abandon this and go way in the opposite direction. And it is crucial to note here that going oversized is not just an aesthetic exercise, and it's not even a proposition for a new trend. The team uses oversized clothes, like everything else in the Maison, with a purpose. Here we see a few different things. One, by making everything massive, uniformly, by the way, an Italian size 74, which corresponds in Walmart sizing to an XXXXL. Very big. So by uniformly making this stuff size 74, the Maison proposes a solution to the systemic problem they highlighted in their spring 1997 season. The fashion system produces clothes in a uniform way using a sizing system that doesn't necessarily, but more often just straight up doesn't, fit at all with the bodies that are meant to buy and wear those clothes. So a possible solution that they propose here is making everything massively oversized. Now, here in the present, this idea has kind of been done to death. With all of the increased conversation about size inclusivity and androgyny in fashion, there have been a number of brands that just kind of phone in a solution to this by doing shapeless, baggy clothes. It's been done so much that the conversation around size inclusivity and androgyny in fashion has moved to a place where it's saying this is not a viable solution. You're not fixing a problem here, you're just releasing very baggy clothes. But to give the Maison credit, at the time when this show came out in 1999, there really wasn't anyone who was doing this in high fashion. Paris fashion was largely overtaken at the time with a skinny silhouette in the late 90s and early 2000s. This was one of the most body-excluding times in recent fashion memory. Fashion, of course, experiments with sizing and with different shapes all the time, but up to that point, no one had done such an extremely oversized silhouette in a Paris runway context. Dang it. Fashion, of course, experiments with shape and with silhouette all the time, but up to that point, no one had done sizing in this extreme a way. Again, it's an Italian 74. It's very big. So we see yet another first from the Maison here. The message being made more fully clear by the symbolism of the models walking around a pair of torn-off stiletto heels on their individual ersatz runways. Sorry, I've been looking for an excuse to use the word ersatz for my whole life, I think. The symbol of the torn off stiletto heels is the Maison rejecting this symbol of fashion standards for women, and walking around the destroyed symbol is a proposal for a new kind of beauty, one where a woman's body isn't being scolded by her own clothes. But we're not done. You thought we were done? We're not. There is always more to unpack. Margiela is not simply saying, let's make this oversized. That's agreeable for everyone, right? You have to take into consideration and be in awe of the size of this lad. Absolute unit. We're not talking about baggy clothes that are like a hoodie. Like, try if you can. I really wish we had the clothes here so that I could do a side-by-side comparison, but this is not just baggy clothes. Kat Debo contextualizes this really well. I referenced her earlier. Kat is the director of the Mode Museum in Antwerp and one of the leading scholars on Martin's work. She said it like this, quote, "When worn, these extremely oversized items tend to sway on the body. They demand a different body posture and tempo from their wearers and, by virtue of their radical presence, compel full awareness," end quote. This isn't an oversized clothing cop-out. This is still bringing the otherworldly element that fashion does best. It makes you aware of your body, aware of the clothes, and offers the wearer a transformative feeling. Let's talk about the broken stiletto heels that are on the runway in this show and the famous heelless shoes that came about from this collection. Should we do an all rise? I think we should. All rise. Heels have always been an important part of the Maison's story. The original tabby shoe was given a very specific heel, a cylindrical block that's the same diameter as an average human heel. And when designing the shape of a pump, shoemakers often talk about the way that shape will affect the wearer's walk. Margiela's heel height and shape allowed for a more normal gait, where the flattering elements of a heel were still intact, but there was no forced femininity added to their walk. Your walk could just be your walk. You may be seated. But here in this show, we see more typical shoe shapes. It's a stiletto and a derby, worn without any heel at all. And it's really weird looking, right? Like, we've been so conditioned to see this general shape of shoe and to see a heel attached to it, right? I mean, same with the derbies, to be honest. Even if we're not talking about stilettos, there's still this visual expectation that there's going to be this heel behind it. So why are they abandoning the heels? This is yet another symbol of defiance against the industry and the normal codes of wealth and privilege that Margiela has always loved making fun of. Heels on shoes are more than 500 years old and were arguably, when we're talking about historic stuff, especially that far back, you have to hedge a little, so I'm going to say arguably. They were arguably created so horse riders could be more stable on their stirrups. You could kind of lock them into place a little bit. But owning a horse was a status symbol, so these wealthy folks that needed these shoes for practical reasons would often wear their heeled shoes everywhere to be like, hey guys, I don't want to brag, but I own a horse. As time went on, heels were only allowed to be worn by royalty, as ordered by Louis XIV into French law. And to bring that up to the modern era of the 90s, heels were generally, especially in a Paris fashion context, worn by women of privilege and wealth. Heels in the 90s were a way for women to communicate, I am well off enough that I do not have to be in a hurry when I am walking anywhere. Now, of course, the feminist conversation around pumps here in the present has moved past this dichotomy. It's a lot more complicated now, but at the time in 1999, especially in a Paris fashion context, this was a conversation worth having. So here we see the Maison enter into the new millennium with a new silhouette while somehow managing to maintain the core trademarks of the house. We find ourselves today in fall/winter 2000. That might have been a little loud on the 2000. I'm sorry if you're watching on a flat screen. We will start by setting the scene. We do actually have some interesting details to cover with the location here. Martin has always been keen on breaking with tradition, and usually Paris fashion shows at that time were staged in huge tents near the Louvre, and since the beginning, Martin would pull his audience into places of everyday life, like a post office, a cafe, a playground, etc. Okay, so this show reflects those same sentiments, but we go one step further. This is a disused train warehouse. It was freezing cold on the night of this show, and all Fashion Week, the press and the buyers have been bathed in the most luxurious side of French culture, and now they've had to travel across town and descend, shivering, into an abandoned train station. I feel like this show is meant to communicate that the world is made up of more than just the shimmering, fun brightness of the world of the rich and privileged. And down here, where it is cold and it's dark, I think they're trying to say that there's beauty to be found here as well. And it's not the same kind of beauty. It's a more human, less staged kind of beauty. Okay, so the audience comes in. They're seated in the gold Napoleon III chairs, which have now become a staple part of the Maison's shows. Bird chirping sounds play over the loudspeakers while everyone gets settled in. And then the Pink Room from David Lynch's Twin Peaks plays as the first song. Many of the guests were seated outside of the train cars, others are sat inside of them. The lights inside the train cars go off and then come back on, which is the same strategy that was used in the presentation last season. The audience of each train car is in isolation. They're only seeing one look on its own, one look at a time. The lights out effect kind of acts like a palate cleanser so that you're not getting all of the baggage of the entire runway show. You're able to focus truly on just one look at a time. There were some people that resonated very deeply with the way that they set this show up. There were a few journalists who claimed that this was simulating the Nazis shuffling Jewish people into boxcars to be taken off to concentration camps, which, I don't know, to me that sounds far-fetched at best. But then there were also some journalists who said this emulated the austere luxury of Cristobal Balenciaga shows, so there was a very mixed bag among different critics. In this show, we're continuing on the same general two-show theme pattern that's been typical for the last few years of the Maison's work. The Maison establishes a concept in the spring show and then builds on that concept in the fall show. So we're back here again with the massively oversized silhouettes, just like in Spring-Summer 2000. I'm not sure if this is actually relevant, but in the Spring-Summer 2000 show, they distinctly said these are Italian size 74 clothes, and in the Fall-Winter show, they are Italian size 78. I'm not sure that if you were just eyeballing it, you would be able to see the difference between a 74 and a 78. They both just look gargantuan, but that is a true thing about this show. But again, we're dealing with massively oversized clothes at a time when the industry was very focused on a slim silhouette. That was most often expressed through low-rise skinny jeans. This show was very contrarian. And it's not just the clothes. Even the sequins in this show are this like spilling over kind of oversized. These look like massive bokehs in a camera, don't they? I like that a lot. We also introduce a bedrock motif into the oversized work in this collection. The details of a garment that are meant to be hidden on the insides of the clothes were presented on the outside. That's something that we've seen since the very first runway show from Margiela. We see that most clearly in the darts on the bust of this look, and it's the interior structure of a blazer here placed on the outside. Another big thing to note here is that the walks of the models are very, very slow. That's likely because of the low light in this space. That necessitated a slower walk, otherwise the cameras wouldn't be able to capture the models and their looks effectively. And there's some pretty good precedents for this as well. Margiela was known in his early work for making the models walk in a very natural way to sort of avoid this high fashion Parisian walk that is more typical of runway models. A lot of that can be explained just from the construction of the tabby itself. The cylindrical heel's diameter is the same width as a human heel. And having a block heel instead of a stiletto allows you to have a little bit more of your natural gait in the walk. But even beyond that, there were things like in the Spring-Summer 1990 show, Margiela would put the models just on the regular ground with no runway so that they would have to walk in the normal way or else they'd probably trip. Usually really fast runway walks are done so that you can see the clothes moving on the body. It's much faster than any person would normally walk. It's like speed walking basically. But in this case, in this show here in Fall Winter 2000, I think the purpose of a slow walk is done partially just so that there's more impact of you being in the room with the models themselves. You're packed into this tiny little train car, and when the lights are going out and coming back on, you're able to look up and there's less of this impersonal fast speed walking. It's much more of this I am here present with you kind of walk. It adds a lot of intimacy, and then it honestly adds a lot to the kind of horror twinge surrealism that Margiela has always been known for, where things are always kind of making you feel a little bit uneasy, but you're not fully able to articulate why. I think the slow walk adds to that a lot as well. And I mean, hey, leave it up to Margiela to take on a challenging task of, we want to combine intimacy with horror twinge surrealism. How do we make that work together? Another distinct element that separates this oversized show from the previous oversized show is that before, in Spring-Summer 2000, the expert tailors at the Maison were taking vintage garments and then they were cutting them up and expanding them so they became an Italian size 74. We pontificated about a couple of reasons why this could be. The one that makes the most sense to me, looking back at it, is that they were trying to do a comparison between vintage textiles and new textiles. If they put them both together in the same really striking, massive garment, then there's a little bit more of a like, oh wow, look, these are really different. Kind of a side-by-side comparison thing. So for this show, we don't have any specific notes about this in the in the Bible. But what I think they did for this one is they took vintage dead stock fabrics and they used those to create completely new clothes in an Italian size 78. So instead of taking vintage clothes and expounding upon them, they took vintage textiles and created completely original garments that were massively oversized. One incredible piece that exemplifies this change is the biker jacket. Here we can see that this was clearly not expounded upon because it has the same beautiful aging and wear all over the jacket. And this is something that occasionally you'll hear designers talk about where they'll say there's a totally different mood to a fabric. Thank you, mood. Not mood like that. There's a totally different feel to a fabric if the fabric is laid on a table and allowed to sit undisturbed for 10 years. That the fabric settles into itself, it has a different hand, it even looks different, it drapes differently. If you compare that to one that has just come off of the looms. And so here I think the Maison was trying to demonstrate that with their actual product, where they were taking on the huge challenge of sourcing vintage textiles that have not been disturbed and then creating clothes out of those. And with this biker jacket, I mean, the reward for doing all of that work was immense. Like, I mean, this thing is gorgeous. As is often the case, the theme of anonymity is explored by covering the eyes of the models. Here, that's done with wigs that have exaggerated bangs. This is a bit more naturalistic and a heavy break away from the pretty extreme dark eye makeup or from the almost sunglasses-esque coverings that have dominated their previous runway shows. Hey, please don't forget to leave what you learned in this video down in the comments. Even if someone has already said your thing, I want to hear it in your words. Typing stuff out and actually writing things down, even if it's just a random place like a YouTube comment section, that really helps to cement things in your brain. So, what's the one thing that you learned about this show? Put it in the comments. Let's keep moving. Another huge difference between the spring, summer, and the current collection here in 2000 is that these clothes are they look much bigger. There's a volume that's been added to these clothes so that the models are pretty literally swimming in those clothes rather than them hanging over their actual natural frame. Okay, so again, in here, what they call this is hot molding, and they weren't super clear in the actual text as to what that actually meant, but here's what I've come up with. If I am incorrect here, please feel free to correct me. I love corrections, but I'm pretty sure this is what it is. Hot molding, it would seem, is the process of getting fabrics to assume a certain shape by applying heat to them. In this case, they wanted the garments to stay very out. They wanted them to feel as if they were being completely filled up by the person wearing them, to show off that volume. So it's a similar situation to when milliners want a hat to stay in a certain shape. They apply heat to the hat while it's over a mold, and then when you take it off, it just stays in that shape. The Maison found these extra large mannequins, and then they apply that heat molding technique to them while the clothes were on them, so that then when they came off and were put onto the models, they were still fully voluminous. The pants were also tailored to this massively exaggerated size, but they were able to stay tightly onto the models because they would fold over the extra fabric and loop it together with a hook and eye. And this is one of those magical items when a self-imposed restraint ends up turning out to be a truly good idea. The excess cloth folded over itself looks strikingly good here. I honestly look at these and I'm like, damn, I really want a pair of those. Welcome to Spring Summer 2001. It is October 12th, 2000, and we have actually a really unusual episode. We're honing in on a pretty specific detail of this season. We have a lot more to cover about this season more broadly, and most of that is just going to be covered in the Patreon exclusive part of this episode. Things like these bizarre skirts, the stranger shapes, the gloves top, the care tags top, all of this is just going to be in the Patreon exclusive extended version of this episode. So if you love this series and you want the full experience, go sign up and get to work watching the extended versions of just a ton of the episodes in this series. All right, so we're going to be primarily living in a single motif from this season. Not even an entire theme. We're literally just living in a single solitary motif. The Maison's use of the color red. This is going to give us a really good example of how a designer marries their concept with the final design that appears in a runway. Let's do it! Okay, cool, let's go, let's do this. Since the beginning, Martin's use of red has been quiet, but very consistent. The very first show had red in the outfits themselves, as well as the red footmarks that were left by the shoes on the cotton runway. And that same red painted cotton showed up in the second season as their very first artisanal piece. We had Fall/Winter 1995, where the entire collection was done up in shades of red. We've had a lot of photographs and lighting appearing in red tints, and then we have Isaac interrupting the shot. No, stop. And throughout the oeuvre, there's been little sprinklings of red that are used as an accent color, and even some very weird uses of red, like the bloodstains on the garments in spring-summer 1999. This crimson red color has traveled with us the entire time that we've looked at Martin's clothes. But here we're asking the question, how are they actually using this color? If we think about the most typical uses of red, what do we find? So especially in fashion, and especially in French high fashion, red is a romantic color, right? It represents fiery love, passion. We often see red used now in lipstick and in nails and like the bottoms of stilettos. And it's always used to portray this kind of wilder side of womanhood, right? And that doesn't feel naturally very Margiela, does it? The house that's about upending convention and doing away with Parisian codes and priorities, why are they choosing to consistently use this red color? I mean, besides the symbolic context, the house is clearly so good at monochromatic looks that they rightly avoid cerulean for their jackets, and they rightly don't make skirts in chartreuse. So why do we keep coming back to bright red, almost this obnoxious crimson color? I think that we are witnessing a very clever cultural sleight of hand here. How do I show sleight of hand? What do you, like, I tricked you. Fashion tends to adopt new ideas very slowly. At the time, in like the late 90s and in the early 2000s, they were still romanticizing this idea of, you know, the symbolism of like red, the color of passion. But they were doing it in a little bit of a different way. Because there was this cynicism in the 90s and the 2000s that was generally wanting to buck against convention. So most designers were finding new ways of being romantic while gently poking fun at the idea of this symbolism. So like here we can see that there's a different use of color. They're not using red, but we can still see that this stuff is intended to be like this playful, cutesy, passionate image of a young woman. It's just being updated with modern color trends from that time. The same feeling is being called back to with the trope of red. It's just being done in a different way. But also the 90s and 2000s were this huge era of flat humor. I've always thought that was best shown with the hit drink from 1993 called OK Soda. OK Soda. It's fine. So this is more in the style of what Martin was doing. Martin is, through his use of red, making almost a flat, deadpan joke about the trope of red being passionate and womanly. Because red is about passion. If you're a woman, and we are talking about women in this show, if you're a woman and you want to express this passionate, wild side of yourself, everyone can wear red. Rockefeller and waitress. It's unlike any other thing in Paris fashion tropes where it's a universal color that is accessible to everyone. There's no elitism to red. But Margiela, as we've said, has always had this monochromatic, avant-garde, deconstructed, refusing convention deal going on, right? And that leads back to our question, why is he engaging with this corny trope of red? And I think that's because at its core, in everyone's innermost self, even the most cynical people, we all long in some way for the comfort of convention. There's something there that all of us want to go back to. Conventions feel tried and true, and they feel safe. And even if that convention was laid down in a time when we weren't even alive, there's this, I think, strange pull of nostalgia for ideas like red, the color of passion, or a man should wear a well-tailored suit. But the problem, of course, is that many of these conventions exclude some of our friends, or at times they seem to exclude everyone. Beauty standards, gender roles, the list goes on as long as you're willing to look at it. But I do think that there is this part of human nature that longs for the safe feeling of convention. And I think that that's part of why Martin chose to go with a convention that doesn't exclude anyone. Red. But here within this show, there's this quality of being able to make fun of those conventions and kind of mock them while still being able to fall back into them and embrace them for their safety. And it looks out of place, as it should. Red is not a typical color. But it finds its way in a quick flash and a handful of looks every few seasons. And it's cynical in a perfect way. It's flat, it's deadpan. It does mock the convention of the lady in the red dress, this sexed up icon of the male gaze. And Margiela has used this in the past, like in his first show. to demonstrate that icon as a side of women that they can pull out and put away at their discretion. It's not the full stereotype. There's no push-up bra, there's no perfectly disheveled curly blonde hair, but in its own way, the legacy of red in Martin's shows has been a bohemian, very 1990s image of the sexually empowered woman that the stereotype tries and fails to capture. This use of red just feels more honest, which is Martin's specialty, right? And here in this show, Spring Summer 2001, we see a playful mockery of that trope, and we see, interestingly, the gender flipped in the suspenders of what is literally part of men's suiting. It kind of adds to the tension of the legacy of the woman in the red dress with the women's power dressing of the 1980s. But kind of like the woman in the red dress trope, what's so strange about the power dressing thing is that it doesn't look very powerful, at least in hindsight. We're getting into the realm of opinions here, and this is just my opinion, but this to me strikes me much more as dress up that's being dictated by the male gaze still. But this here, this is men's suiting, and it's big men's suiting. There is no male gaze here. And that's not to say that attempts from women to nip their waist in or to achieve a more hourglass figure are somehow bad. I'm definitely not telling anybody how to dress. What I'm trying to do is really hone in on what this show is trying to discuss. So I don't want there to be any confusion here. There definitely is no value assessment from me personally about this thing. I'm just trying to uncover what Martin is, I think, saying in this show. We actually see another flip on the stereotype by referencing historic womanhood with these widely cut skirts that have incorporated peignets. Peignets are a fashion historic relic of the 17th and 18th centuries. They present another interesting clash with our current cultural mindset about the use of the color red, because peignets remind us of an age that we all think of as being full of strict modesty and sexual suppression. And the use of red with the peignet skirt is another way of adding that cognitive dissonance that was also present in the gender flip from the suiting look. And in a more subtle way, we get a similar tension from the red turtleneck. Out of all of the garments that reflect a wild, fiery, passionate attitude, turtlenecks probably finished last in that list. But this has always been the case for Margiela. He's proposing a sexiness that's very anti-1980s. The idea of strappy sexiness kind of fades away when you consider how much sexier it is just to be a confident person wearing what you want. And again, I'm not making any value assessments. I think that the goal here is to propose that women have lots of different options for this, that sexiness and stoicism and intellectualism, that these are not monoliths within women, that these things can be expressed in a variety of different ways, as many different ways as there are people. And what's so cool is that watching over this whole collection is this familiar symbol in the Maison's body of work. This is the iridescent plastic coverings over the model's eyes. And I think this is a good way to remind us that the Maison doesn't make its statements angrily. It's not rebelling or like doing the middle finger up at like conventions or whatever. It's expressing all of these things in a very joyous way. There's no deep, angry cynicism when they're challenging these cultural conventions. There's joy to it. There's no big, bright, waitressy smile with it. It's still the same house. Austere, surreal, a little twinge of horror here and there. But we can't forget that a fundamental part of the Maison is an honest joy. Okay, so we honed in really deep in this episode, but I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about how much thought was going into the Maison's use of even a very small motif. And ultimately, this is the reason why this house is such a fulfilling one to love. I was very drawn into the mystery of these clothes and these shoes and these mysterious looking photographs. I remember looking at this stuff in 2014 and being just so convinced that there was something there to uncover, that there was some nuanced storytelling and cultural commentary that was happening if I could just put the pieces together. And it does feel really good to know that this stuff goes as far down as you want to take it. We find ourselves in fall-winter 01. We're continuing the theme that's been big with the Maison for a number of different seasons, where they divide the runway into sections so that everyone is taking in the runway one look at a time. This is a looser expression of that idea since you really can see everything else around you, so I'm not sure this one counts as much, but the idea is still there. So there's a challenge with runway shows as an art form. Most of the time, the people who are looking at your runway show are at Fashion Week, Paris Fashion Week, where beforehand they went to probably London and Milan and New York, and they're overwhelmed with runway shows. They're probably seeing 4 or 5 of them a day, and this is yet another runway show in the long line of many runway shows that they will not only have to watch, but then have to cover if they're journalists. So the Maison has a really elegant solution for this in this runway show. They kind of jolt you awake with this really loud drumming that ends up getting played the entire show. This is one of a few different strategies that they've used over the years to sort of like force people to wake up and take in the world around them and be present with them during the show. In addition to that, those drummers set a really great mood for this show. This is also a reference back to Fall/Winter 1990, the 4th show, which also had live drummers. Another reference to that same Fall 1990 show is the reuse of tabby boots from that season. Here, those are seen with some nylon stockings covering the boots. So that classic motif of the models' faces being covered is now being done with tabby boots. Other boots in this collection here, Fall/Winter 01, those were painted white, and others, oddly enough, had fuchsia-colored star stickers on them. Additionally, the boots from Fall/Winter 1990 were resold to now have wedge heels instead of the cylindrical heels that we can just barely see here in the video. Did you catch it? It's kind of hard to see in that footage, but I have slowed it down, gone frame for frame, and I feel very confident that in Fall/Winter 1990, they did in fact have the regular cylindrical block heel, and that here in this show, they've resold them to have wedge heels. Final styling and accessories note here, the model's eyes do remain uncovered this season, but they did have these eye strips that extended into their hair the same way that the red extended into the skirts from last season. Again, we see that the body and the coverings of the body, the decorations of the body, are blending together. This is called a motif. Motif. M-O-T-I-P-H-E. Motif. I'm sorry, that is incorrect. Iridociclida. One piece that leads us to our big focus today is this Spencer jacket. This jacket had disproportionate shoulders and sleeves, and there's a couple of points that we want to cover here. The first is that we're continuing in the same vein as the doll's wardrobe theme. In those collections, the doll's clothes are this big, obviously, and then they create clothes that are normal size clothes, this big clothes. And when they made the full-size clothes, they would blow them up proportionally. And then when they were people-sized, we could see that dolls' clothes aren't actually cut like regular clothes at all. They have really unusual shapes to them. So here again, we're looking at Margiela's interpretation of a Spencer jacket. Spencers have always been tight and cropped. They're meant to fit like this. So here, Margiela is taking a piece that would normally be very shrunken on the torso, and they are making it super duper oversized. For those keeping score at home, we don't actually have a record of what the Italian size is for these Margiela oversized clothes. We went from 74 to 78 to 80. I assume that we're still in 80. They just all look like massive clothes to me. But either way, we can see that it takes on a wildly different shape than the original Spencer jackets when it is oversized, of course. So we learn an important lesson here from Margiela's experimentation, and that is that the size of the jacket affects the mood of what that jacket communicates a great deal. In order to do your own interpretation of a jacket, you don't have to totally reinvent that article of clothing. You can do something as simple as zoom, enhance. We cheat a little bit here because the Maison's tailors did alter the shoulders and the sleeve length, so those things are very exaggerated, but the lesson is still here. The second point here is that we need to talk about the historical context of the Spencer jacket, because that's where things really, really get good here. Margiela has reached back into the past for inspiration since his very first show. He did this first with the jabot in spring-summer 1989, which used to be a men's neck accessory. This was used in the first season as a neck accessory, as well as a brassiere and as a bracelet. Another key use of historic inspiration for the Maison was in spring-summer 1991, where they used the farmer ring, which farmers were apparently able to use kind of as a portable sundial. Do not ask me how that works. I have no clue. This is not a science channel. I'm more of a liberal arts kind of guy. First appearing in the 1790s, the Spencer jacket was essentially a tailcoat jacket with no tails. It was an upper echelon type garment for men, and it was eventually adopted by the English military for casual wear. Later in the Regency period, which is around the 18 teens, it became a jacket for women. It's kind of rare that you see a garment that's primarily used by one gender and then it switches and is used by another gender. That isn't something that never happens, but especially considering the military associations, this seems like kind of a standout example of that. But you can see why women would adopt it, right? It's a very form-fitting piece. It kind of helps to encourage an hourglass figure. It kind of makes sense. Okay, so Martin has played with gender roles for most of his career. He's especially dug in very hard on that since he started exploring oversized silhouettes. And usually Martin is placing women in men's garments. We've seen that for a number of different seasons here, these massive oversized men's suiting pieces. And in many cases, those items were vintage pieces that were literally used by men. But here we see a different kind of message about gender roles. We see a jacket that was originally made for men, was later adopted for women, and then is updated in this show by making it so oversized that it again looks like it's tailoring meant for men, but is here seen on a woman. Wow, so many gender role reversals. OMG, OMG. It's a great reminder that most, if not all, gender roles are just literally made up. They don't have a lot of basis in biological reality. They're just societal suggestions, oftentimes suggested in a rather rude and forceful way. This little kickflip from Margiela also enforces that femininity and masculinity are not monoliths. We have another incredible example of this with the isolated collars and cuffs. I'm so excited to talk about this example. This is so cool. Okay, so let's look here. We see an isolated collar and we see isolated sleeve cuffs. Where, oh where have we seen isolated collars and cuffs? No, not Magic Mike, you perv. They're from Chippendales, the touring striptease troupe. Can we please try to stay focused here? Thanks, I'd appreciate that. Okay, so we see a very well-known cultural reference to very prototypical masculinity. But also, you know who else has isolated collars and cuffs? It's another like super obvious one. Have you guessed? You're gonna kick yourself when I tell you. Playboy bunnies. So we see another motif here that has a baseline of sexiness, but it holds big cultural weight for stereotypes in both masculinity and femininity. But the kicker here is that we don't see this in an outfit that just oozes sexiness. Like for how obviously over the top, kind of cornily sexy this and this is, like this is just like, you know, is not sexy at all. By comparison, I think all Margiela stuff is very sexy. But if we do look at the outfits more broadly in this show, they're all a really great example of Margiela's specific take on more sexy outfits. These are big, dark clothes that don't encourage ogling, but they're styled in a way that is pretty sexy. And it's worth noting that there are some very sultry looking outfits in this collection. Some looks that are definitely skimpy and a few that some would even describe as scandalous. But I think that just further emphasizes the Maison's real point here. Embracing one's sexuality is a varied thing. It doesn't always look the same from person to person, and it doesn't even always look the same coming from the same person on a different day. It's varied and it's multifaceted, just like in real life. We find ourselves in spring summer 2002, spring summer 2002, buckle in. Okay, so I pulled a muscle yesterday and it hurts really bad and we have a lot to get through here. I don't know if you could see that or not, there was a lot. So I'm gonna try to stay enthusiastic while my neck is in pain. So Martin and the crew are back to doing unorthodox presentations. We return to the short film in a showroom format. So people with the invitations would come to the showroom and just be shown a short film. This was held at a little place called Le Corona, which is a bar/tobacco shop in the first R&D small. I know that many of you are tired of me saying this, but we gotta rehash it again for the people who are just starting out in the series. Margiela popularized guerrilla runway shows. It was the standard for most brands to show near the Louvre in the first R&D small, all in the same place, these temporary tents that were set up near the Louvre. Margiela has always shown in very populous places, playgrounds, cafes, post offices, places like that. Having your own unique place to do a runway show is very common now, but it definitely wasn't back then. So in the early years of the brand, doing a runway show in the first R&D small was a big no-no. It was a little bit too establishment. But Martin and the team did show in the first R&D small back in spring 1998 with Rei Kawakubo at the Conciergerie, and just recently in spring 2001. The idea here is that I think they're inching closer to Margiela as a brand being part of the fashion establishment, which the facts back up. I mean, they're on the official calendar now. People want to go to it. They're very well known worldwide. Margiela is an established part of the fashion system. But to kind of get in touch with their roots, they are doing it in a showroom that is in the first arrondissement technically, but it is in the most populous place possible, which is just a grimy bar and tobacco shop. This is really interesting. The staff at the bar were the ones explaining the collection to the attendees when they were watching the short film, which is a very interesting relinquishment of control there. And actually something really interesting, the Bible, it tells us that the short film that was shown was 16 minutes long, but the only short films that I could find in reference to this season were 5 minutes long. I have checked with all of my connections, some of which are very good connections, and everyone just says that in their personal archives, they only have a 5-minute video. So we'll work with what we got today. Just a minute, there's an event in Pokemon Go. I have to catch this. Yeah. Hey! For every second that you're not joining the Patreon, you're actively hurting my feelings. This is a passion project and I'm actually losing money on every episode I make of this. They take an enormous amount of time and effort. Also, if you're not on the Patreon, do you not want to see the full episodes? Like if you're working through this if you're working through the entire series, it makes sense that you would want to learn everything. I don't know, like the extended episode for this one, for example, is massive. Like most of the really good information, just the way that I format these, it ended up being in the Patreon exclusive part of the episode. Support independent fashion journalism, but also you just get a lot of good stuff with it. Patreon.com/BlissFoster. Just go, thank you. Go do that, please. Margiela asked a creative agency in London that's called Intro. Like the name of the agency is just Intro. They asked them to create a short film for the collection this season. Margiela didn't want to do a standard collection film. Standard obviously isn't really his thing, and it was Intro's job to find a way to make this thing really go off. As you can see, they crushed it. Intro got a house fitting model and filmed the collection in 16mm, then did some heavy editing and post-production. I'm not a pro with camera gear, but my understanding is that you would use 16mm in order to emphasize things that are in the foreground, the details of things in the foreground. So this ends up working out really well if you want to emphasize something like clothes. And speaking of clothes, we have an incredible variation on the idea of anonymity this season. It's one of those things where you could watch this entire short film on its own and possibly miss it. Throughout the history of Maison Martin Margiela, we've known about this idea of anonymity. It's obviously like one of the first things that you learn about the house, right? And it's been interesting to trace the history of how that anonymity gets expressed. Here, for the first time in this season, we have digital anonymity. And while that seems like a superficial approach to the theme, I assure you it is not. There's a concept that I learned about a long time ago in college when we had to read a book called Understanding Comics. So this book is actually, it's one of the best textbooks that I ever had. It's an academic text that talks about comics as an art form, but the whole thing is a comic book. Okay, so there's this great section where they talk about images, illustrations becoming more and more abstract. We look at the illustration on one end and it is very realistic, right? It could almost be a photograph. There's no mistaking at all that that is a human face. And as we move farther to the right in these illustrations, we lose detail very quickly, but our brains never stop saying, yes, that is a human face. But there's something else that's kind of happening subconsciously in our brains. The farther right in these illustrations that we go, the more our brains start to think that could be anyone's face. It could be said to represent more and more people the farther right we get. So the one on the far left that is photorealistic, that one is pretty much just one person's face. When we look at that, all of us look at it and say, yep, that's not me. But the more abstract the illustration becomes, even down to literally a circle, 2 dots, and a line, not only do we continue to say, yep, that's a human face, but the more it might possibly in the right context be our own face. So the post-production effects in this video take us to a similar place. Anonymity has been expressed in the past as exactly that, anonymity. There's clearly a woman walking there and she is anonymous. We can't tell who she is. But because this is footage of an actual person walking, we don't get the same effect. It's just hiding the person's identity. But here, we not only have the identity of the people's faces covered, but we have also generalized them in the same way that we understand from this illustration. These are not simply a specific woman whose face is being hidden. This is approaching the every woman idea. Now, it's not full fidelity with the far right illustration here. This is still a tall, thin woman, for example. We can see a bit of her features, etc., but the principle here is still the same. By minimizing the personal facial features of the house model, we expound this out to encompass more people than just the one person. This is being used to say, these clothes are for you. I recently rediscovered an interview from The Guardian with Maison Margiela, and I think it's relevant here, though this technically happened before this collection came out. The interviewer is asking, if the models are secondary, why use glamorous ones? And they're just talking about their use of Kate Moss and other supermodels in their runway shows and still using the masks. The Maison said, quote, "For the majority of our collections, we believe it is opportune to focus on the combined forces of the physical presence of women of many ages and backgrounds," end quote. And this here is a great example of the combined forces of the physical presence of many women. It's a composite, but it's not condescending. This is not an oversimplification or a stereotype of women. And in a lot of ways, go with me here, please. This is a lot like the classic iPod commercials, one of the most memorable advertising campaigns of all time. It is important to point out that these iPod commercials came out after this collection, so this was not some kind of copy. By minimizing the details of their personal features, you are just left with a person. And it's a good chance that among the 5 or 6 people shown in the iPod commercial, that one of them reminds you of yourself. And they're in this wonderful, abstract environment with this object. The vagueness of everything other than the object sort of tricks your brain into thinking that this object is not just useful or well designed. The object is part of yourself. The object is you. Now there is a cynical side of us that can hear what I just said and say, that is bullshit. When advertisers are really brilliant and that brilliance gets explained, it can often feel very threatening. We don't like to think that our emotions and our conscious brains are being manipulated, especially when that manipulation is compelling us to buy expensive electronics or to shop at Target. I get that. But I don't feel like there's a lot of manipulation here. Again, this isn't an advertisement. This wasn't aired publicly. And unlike advertisements that employ similar techniques, I think the Maison's film stands apart because it's honest. Like when Margiela says, hey, this is for you. It's a really special object, and I think that if you gave it a shot, it could occupy a special part of your life. I tend to believe him. I mean, it's one thing if Apple is shoving some electronics down our throat, but it's a really different thing if a fashion house that might as well be categorized as an art collective is taking the less profitable route at almost every single turn and making many of these products by hand in their Parisian studio. This short film is a great way of framing that in a really subtle way, and honestly, I think it's pretty beautiful. Okay, so let's wind it back here. As is often the case at the Maison, they set up parameters for themselves to guide the creation of the collection. Here there were actually 3 different categories of parameters: cuts, circles, and folds. Folds is the super crazy one. This shit is nuts. The results of this self-imposed challenge are really crazy. I hadn't heard about anything actually from this collection prior to researching for this series, and I am so glad I know about it now. Especially the folded clothes. Like, I'm not trying to overhype it, but we basically have origami clothes. It's so crazy. We find ourselves in fall/winter 2002. It's a banger. This is a really good one. I like this one a lot. This show is significant because it helps to further canonize the way that the Maison redefines luxury. Because that's been the whole thing, right? The statements that Martin and the team have made are only valuable within the context of luxury Parisian fashion. Someone could be walking down the street with a sign and be saying like, there are so many problems with the luxury fashion system in Paris. Sizing is weird. Women's bodies are depicted in really shitty, weird ways. There's lots of problems with the Parisian. And it's not that this hypothetical person is wrong necessarily. It's just that that's very easy to do. I mean, pretty much anyone who looks at the fashion system can identify that those problems are there. But for a designer who is not only accepted in that system, but praised in that system to spend his career critiquing the system, that is when things get interesting. Okay, so in this show, we don't necessarily have a criticism of the fashion system. We have what I would call a complication. In academia, or at least in literature academia, people will often start off their theses or dissertation by saying that their goal is to, quote, complicate our understanding of blank. Now, this sounds like something that an asshole might say, but it's actually pretty useful because complications help us to see things that have normally gone overlooked. We're apparently doing this a lot today. All right, look. This is the part of the video where I'm supposed to plug the Patreon. Everything that I've ever read indicates that me plugging this out loud with my face and voice is what's going to help make people join the Patreon. I'm kind of over this like salesman-y way of coming up with like funny ideas and ways for you to join it. This is just the reality of the situation. I can't keep doing this if I don't have literal financial support. So if you like this series, if you like the stuff, go join it. Takes 30 seconds. It starts at $3 a month. You get a bunch of stuff because of it. Please do that. Or don't. It's up to you. Let's focus on looks 18 and 20. Men in the distinctive Margiela white lab coats come to the runway carrying clear plexiglass cases that might remind us of museum cases. Inside of those cases were vintage handbags that were wrapped completely in a piece of washed white cotton, which masked all of the details of the bags themselves. Le Monde magazine referred to these in their review as post-logo leather goods, which is actually a distinction that sort of applies to everything that the Maison makes, because other than the 4 white stitches, there's just no logos. It's all good design from the Maison. Like the Maison has done before, these bags were just purchased as is from a flea market. After they had the bags, they created these custom protection cases that are kind of, actually, they're like the protection cases for a couch. We're gonna fit that back on later. Even the insides of the bags had this protective white cotton that was able to fit perfectly into it and just cover the walls. And we don't have any photography of that, but as long as it's in the Bible, I believe it. So those protective covers were not mass manufactured, they were actually handmade by the team. They were held together by little snaps and you could undo them completely and throw them into the washing machine, get them back out, snap them back onto the bag and keep using it. This is such a good example of the Maison doing something that took an enormous amount of technical skill, but that the final product speaks very softly. Of course, oftentimes for artisanal pieces, companies want the final product to be screaming very loudly, like, look at me, it took so much effort to make this. But the Maison even kind of mocks this idea of the boisterous declaration of effort. Like, as they often do, they took a found object, they found a way to add value to it, and that value was not some dinky arts and crafts thing, it was a real project that took a lot of professional technical skill to execute. But then the final product does speak very quietly, and that quietness is contrasted with this hilarious image of a guy carrying it like it is a priceless museum piece, like, here you go, your majesty. I don't know, I feel like the humor in the Maison doesn't get talked about enough, and I think that's pretty funny. Here you go, your majesty. Okay, so let's move on to the actual point here. So this also plays into a specific idea of luxury, and I kind of had to tell you that story to tell you this story. So there's been so much ink spilled the last decade or so trying to answer this question, what is luxury? As the luxury market continues to shrink, we've been trying to crack the code of what makes objects so special that you would never consider giving them up. Let me give you an example. The most obvious side of luxury is this side that's like reputable companies making objects where no expense is spared on the quality of that object. Like if you go to Hermes and you get a bag, then you can rest assured that that bag was made to the highest possible standards that humans can hold to each other to make a bag. But then there is this less obvious side of luxury, and that's things like the quilt that your grandmother made for you. And that's an object that is usually handmade. Usually things like that are things that aren't mass manufactured, but it mostly is valuable to you because of personal significance, right? So we've established that at a minimum, luxury has some kind of range to it. Okay, so Martin and the team are trying to occupy something around here in this range. So vintage items in their own way are kind of luxury items, at least in terms of scarcity, right? Like, have you ever gone thrifting, found something that was just unbelievably perfect, something that you just loved so much, you can't believe how lucky you were that you found it? Have you ever tried to find another one of those? It is fucking impossible. And similar to that, luxury goods that are over on this side of luxury, they're usually things where truly only a few of them were actually made, or they're just so expensive that it's like, you're not buying another one, dog. Well, for Hermes customers, they do tend to collect, but I think you understand my point. So we don't have a record of what the Maison stock looked like at the time. I really wish we did. But it's entirely possible that for these two bags, those were the only ones that could be found in the world for all we know. Very, very scarce, that's my point. So we have the scarcity side of fashion, but then we also have this kind of tender, handmade, precious object kind of feel to it as well. The vintage bags are being treated with the kind of obsessive care that you would give to a precious stuffed animal or to like your grandmother's wedding dress. And okay, look, I know that we've been talking about this for, this series has gone on for years at this point, but let's just stop for a second and remember how radical all this stuff actually is. If you told someone, I'm going to make a luxury fashion house that upcycles clothes from a flea market, makes exact replicas of vintage clothes, and sometimes cuts up pieces from my own archive in order to make new stuff, people would think that you were crazy, especially in the 1990s. Everyone in the fashion system, then and now, thought that the whole reason that they're there is to convince people that new clothes rule and old clothes suck. But Martin and the team have slowly built a case over 14 years that old things not only have a use, but have a deeply embedded value to them. And that's a value that can't be replicated by new things. I mean, if we just call this what it is, the Maison's only contribution to these bags is making a cotton case for them. Outside of the context that they've built with their house, that would be a really silly thing for a luxury company to offer. But if you can just catch the vision, you can see that vintage bags are rare and they're special. And they're so special, in fact, that you would want to honor them with the same level of care that you would give to an Hermes Kelly or to a Birkin. That's a pretty radical stance for a luxury fashion house to take. It's a pretty extreme position. Okay, so to kind of contrast with that idea, I keep doing this. I say we to spread the blame out. Everyone here on the team, we all agreed that this was a good thing to do like 8 times in this episode. To contrast with this idea of luxury, we have another set of really iconic pieces from this collection that are probably way better known than the handbags. These just legendary fur pieces. Should we do an all rise? We can do a quick one. All rise. Okay, sit down. These are really cool. The Maison actually used fur before in fall 1997 for these surrealistic fur wigs, and the surrealism continues here with these pieces that most prominently feature 4 arms. And I think that's so wonderful because one of the classic things that skeptics will say about avant-garde fashion is they'll be like, well, really, there's only so much that you can do with it. What are you gonna do? Have 4 arms? Sorry if that gave anyone flashbacks to Thanksgiving with their family. You're not like a real fashion person unless you've heard someone in your immediate like friend or family circle say that to you. The 4 arms thing. And you just gotta sit there and smile and be like, that's a great point. All right, so we have 2 fur coats here that were combined into 1 coat. The fur vests, by the way, were done in the same way, combining 2 coats and eliminating 2 of the 4 sleeves so that it is still sleeveless, but it has these useless sleeves that are hanging down. It's a functional part of the garment that is functionally useless. It just adds to the shape of the look. And that really is a thing about fur coats, right? Like when you see pictures of like the golden age of fur coats, they're like these just like blobs. They kind of look like a Dark Souls boss. I am aware that boss is from Elden Ring. So each of the fur pieces had a red cardboard archival tag that hung from them to accentuate their vintage origin. Yet again, we see the Maison not only making reuse part of their brand identity at large, but they are emphasizing that in the product itself. We've seen this a million times before, but even if you know nothing about the Maison or what they do, the product of this fur coat tells you the story of its new life as a reassembled piece. We find ourselves in spring-summer 2003. Gosh, we're like really moving through this thing. This is crazy. We're all the way up to 2003. The show takes place at the National Theatre of Chaillot on a massive marble stairwell with mirrors on both sides. We've actually seen stairs as a runway once before for the Maison in spring-summer 1992 when it was in an abandoned train station. I think stairs end up being a really useful runway tool for Martin. We already know that he prefers for women to have their natural way of walking when they're on a runway show rather than a professional model walk. There were shows like Spring Summer 1990 that forced the models to walk naturally because they were literally walking on dirt. Stairwells are kind of a similar idea to that in that they prevent you from being able to do the heavy foot slam and like heavy hip swaying that's required in order to do a professional model walk. If you're in heels especially, you have to walk kind of carefully on a stairwell, and that again will kind of bring out the natural characteristics of a person's walk. The few times in other runway shows where we've seen models even for a moment go up on stairs, we kind of see them break their normal model walk because they're like, oh shit, I don't want to trip. Hey, you want to do me a solid real quick and join the Patreon so you can watch the entire Martin Margiela episodes? You get exclusive episodes, you get to watch the live streams back, you get episodes early. It's so sick, you should join it. It starts at $3 a month and it takes 9 seconds to sign up. Go do that, please. Let's dive straight into the conceptual core of this season. All the models wore vintage shoes that the Maison bought from a flea market. So they got the shoes, put them on their feet, and then over the shoes, they put on these lycra tights that are usually used for ballet. The Margiela team then rubbed chalk over the tights to emphasize the construction details of the shoe. It was chalk for the lightly colored ones, and then for the darker colored ones, they would use tailoring chalk, which is white. So that made it where the original flea market shoes shone through in this very ghostly way. Okay, so this is when we get into some really wild stuff. We're gonna do a quick art history lesson. Do you know what frottage is? I didn't know what frottage was before I started researching for this episode. To quote the Tate Modern's definition of frottage, frottage is a surrealist and automatic method of creative production that involves creating a rubbing of a textured surface using a pencil or other drawing material. The surrealist artist Max Ernst was doing frottage in the 1920s to create stuff like this, and this, and this. He would take something that already existed naturally and then use the etching from that to be the foundation for a larger piece of art. If we're just thinking about this in a grade school art class kind of way, it's a pretty simple technique, right? You just get something like a leaf, you do a little like etching of it on a piece of paper, and then you're like, oh cool, I could turn that into like a tree. We'll do a couple of them, and then it's like a forest. Yay! Martin and the team would use the same technique to frottage the details of vintage shoes onto lycra tights that had been stretched over them. So basic stuff, right? This is another example of a fashion designer using some kind of reference to the art world, and the connection between the two is shaky at best, right? Wrong! Frottage was one of the guiding principles of surrealists, and the surrealists were very principled artists. This was back at a time when art movements would have manifestos written for them. They would have guiding principles and goals that weren't just about the art itself, but about society and the human condition. And the surrealists specifically put a lot of emphasis on the subconscious. OMG, is this episode still about Margiela? Yes, it is, Chief. Hang tight, we're getting there. To quote the Museum of Modern Art, the Surrealists borrowed many of the same techniques to stimulate their writing and art, with the belief that the creativity that came from deep within a person's subconscious could be more powerful and authentic than any product of conscious thought. Okay, so the creativity of your subconscious brain is prioritized over the creativity of your conscious brain. Put a pin in that because we're going to come back to it. Over the course of human history, we have made things and we've been progressively getting better at making things. Technology is the easiest way to trace this. Like, for example, the light bulb did not just pop into existence. Humphrey Davy was the first person to figure out that we could make light using electricity. Warren de la Rue created the carbon filament light bulb, but it was way too expensive to manufacture. Joseph Swan managed to make the manufacturing much cheaper, but the light bulbs burned out way too quickly to make them practical or a product anyone would even want to buy. Then Edison swooped in, made a couple of adjustments to literally just a couple of pieces, and made it where it could both be mass manufactured cheaply and also burn long enough to make it a worthwhile product. And that doesn't even talk about the scores of other inventors all over the world that were working on similar improvements to the light bulb at the same time. Things don't just poof into existence suddenly. It is the product of generations of people looking at something and saying, oh, this is really interesting. I bet I can make this just slightly better. Okay, so it's not a one-to-one comparison, but the same general developments happen in art as well. There's a cultural swirl of influences that are constantly happening all around you, and all of those things affect you when it's time for you to make your life's art. Do you remember back in the episode for Spring Summer 1996? It's the one that I have with the thumbnail saying Margiela's finest moment. Martin and the team bought vintage clothes from a flea market, put them up against a wall, photographed them, then took the negatives of those photographs and used them to screen print the photographs of the vintage clothes onto the linings of new clothes. We're sort of carrying that same idea here, albeit in a really new and pretty badass kind of way. I'm gonna say some pretty wild shit here in a second. Please at least give me a second to explain myself before you just say fuck this and turn the video off. You ready? Fashion designers don't really design clothes. The designs for those clothes move through them. When you study fashion design, you're exposed to all the greats, right? You study all of the people that came before you. And when fashion designers actually begin their work, they're still going to fashion exhibitions, looking at old magazines. They're going to flea markets to look for inspiration for their new work. And then they design a collection, and all that the public sees is just this collection that poofed into existence, right? And it looks like that designer was just creating something that came from just inside of him in isolation. All of this looks like it's just happening in a vacuum, but fashion design doesn't happen in a vacuum any more than the light bulb happens in a vacuum. It is the product of a worldwide scope, massive, big clob of influences that are all coming together and then moving through you to make your work. And that's the thing that separates art from technology, is that technology is, in a very literal way, building on each other. Art does build on the influences of what came before you, but it happens in a much more subconscious way. There are, of course, conscious times where you're saying like, oh, this vintage jacket is very cool, let's just remake this and make that part of the collection. But a lot of times those things just happen subconsciously. You've been exposed to your school uniform, you've been exposed to the clothes that your parents wore, and whether or not you realize it, those things are having some kind of effect on how you view those kinds of clothes. I mean, I've talked to thousands of you through Instagram DMs, and I've talked to a lot of especially like younger kids who are designing their first collection, and they don't even realize what they've done, but they've basically recreated the work of Raf Simons and Peter DePotter. And there's no hate to that at all, especially for younger people. If they're just making something because they want to make something, go for it, recreate something, that's totally fine. But sometimes those kids don't even realize that they are literally recreating an aesthetic that Raf Simons all but owns. And it's just because it's moving through their subconscious. They've seen enough archive pages and just been around enough like cool fashion streetwear people that they just sort of have it implanted into their brain that like, oh, that's what's really cool. This like use of like images kind of cut and pasted onto hoodies and stuff. And Martin has always been really transparent about this. While most fashion designers hide beneath this veil of originality, Martin finds beautiful ways of showing his own influences, but more importantly, shedding light on the influences that are driving all of fashion forward: vintage clothing. And the execution here is so subtle that we almost miss it. By using frottage on the shoes, referencing back to the surrealists, there's that emphasis on the subconscious mind. And that's what brings us to a lot of Martin's work, especially in this season. A lot of the conclusions that he comes to in his design work feel like that automatic process that the surrealists so heavily depended on. Like, what if we made a few tailoring adjustments to a skirt, added in a hole in the front, and then we wore it like it's a long shirt dress? Instead of only making wearable accessories, what if we painted a literal shadow of the accessories onto the skin? Martin sees the world in a very different way, and it's almost like when he's moving through his day, there's nothing that's taken for granted. There's no automatic looking for him where it's just kind of like, oh yeah, that's just a curtain, that's just a table. It's like he's seeing everything and all of the possible recontextualizations that the thing could have. Because that would be exhausting, right? Seeing the world in that way. And so I wonder if he's just telling us that the secret to this is that you lean more into the automatic processes of the subconscious mind. We find ourselves today in fall-winter 2003. We have a lot of nuanced details to cover this season, and we're going to be moving very quickly, so stick with me, buckle in. The first big thing to note here is that this is the final season that Martin Margiela will be at Hermes. He started in 1997, and this will literally be the final season at his own house where he will also be at Hermes. His tenure at Hermes will end in October. That is important because Martin has been effectively splitting his time between two separate jobs. None of the shows during his tenure at Hermes have been bad, of course. I've liked all of them, but there's definitely been some evidence that he has had to split his time and has not had as much time to devote to his own label. After this show, he will be fully back and fully focused on just his own house. So this show takes place in a temporary building in Paris that was built to house an exhibition which claimed to be a, quote, three-dimensional journey through an imaginary city retracing history and culture in the 20th century. So it's like a temporary building that was meant to be a museum exhibition. As you can imagine, using that space for a Margiela show is going to feel at least slightly unsettling given Martin's surrealist sensibilities, and even more so because the models were instructed to make a lot of eye contact with the audience. But yeah, an easy way of thinking about this is that they're doing a show in a very elaborate, huge movie set. The models walked down the runway accompanied by two assistants each, who wore black and carried large light boxes to illuminate the models from the front and the back. And everything was covered in party stuff. The Maison's employees in the white lab coats went before everyone else to throw down yellow confetti onto the runway before the show began. It's also kind of funny that they're doing this with the same disaffected body language of someone who's spreading mulch. A little bit less of the like, confetti! And a little bit more of like, confetti, confetti. More party things, the models had tabby boots with confetti glued onto them, and some even held a clump of streamers as they walked, and some had streamers attached to their ankles. And some at least embodied the real body language of confetti and were like, confetti, when they were walking. Shouts out to those models for keeping the vision alive. But yeah, the whole vibe here is like a hangover of the 20th century. Like the big Y2K party has happened and now we all have to go home, and the weird reality of 9 9 a.m. is setting in. Kind of them looking back at the turn of the century a couple of years later. So we have even more experiments with the ways of looking at the past like the Maison has always done, but here for the first time it is the recent past, just 3 years prior, the year 2000. Let's wind it back for a second and talk about the relationship that runway shows have to the collections that are featured in them. This is pretty important to remember generally, but it's especially important in this Margiela show, so we're going to do a quick overview. There's some designers that make that relationship very literal, where the themes and motifs of the clothes themselves are echoed in the location and the model selection and the music. But more often than not, the runway show's setting elements are more like a music video's relationship to the song itself. The two aren't connected in a literal way, it's more a way for the band to explore their own aesthetic, and the two only have a relationship in the context of them being literally connected in a music video. And that's what we're up to in this Margiela show. This location, the really unique lighting for this show, etc. These things do fit nicely into Margiela's exploration of the past, his philosophy of reuse. But it would be dishonest for me to try and make this a one-to-one comparison between the clothes themselves and this artificial city, for example. Now that that is clear, let's move on. One of the most important elements of this collection is the color yellow. What do we typically think of when we think of the color yellow? The sun, sunflowers, the state of Florida, illustrations of the sun, happiness, digital depictions of the sun. Just general optimism, right? That's typically how yellow gets used. So in this show, it's a very, very different context. You know how like your mom's old belt from the 80s that's supposed to be translucent but has turned into this weird yellowish color? That is the kind of yellow that we are dealing with here. The kind of yellow that sets in as a product of age onto fabrics and plastics. So literally, in fact, that they managed to treat these clear PVC belts with a chemical process that sped up the aging and added in that yellow. The color for this season was so challenging, in fact, that one of the headlines that was a review for this show was titled, "Not a Color for Cowards." The yellowing continues with these little charm keychain things that are bunches of old keys and small scissors that are embedded in yellow perspex. Perspex is that clear stuff that's used to make paperweights. Most of the time, the color palette for a season is selected by trend forecasters or by just some big tastemaker at one of the fabric manufacturers. But Martin was apparently inspired by a vacation that he took to Italy before he started on this season and noticed that the facades of one of the very old buildings was getting very yellow with the age. He thought the color was really beautiful, so he took some pictures, took it back to the studio and said, let's figure out some ways to replicate this color in clothes and accessories. Another interesting note is that Susanna Frankel said in her review, quote, "Instead of being used as an accent or attention-seeking fashion statement, yellow is treated simply as another neutral, which makes it a tempting proposition for even the most color-shy consumer with the most apparently challenging complexion." So this is kind of like when Red Octobers came out and all the sneakerhead guys started treating red like it was a neutral color for shoes. But I don't treat them like a neutral. Well, maybe I do. So it's almost like because he was using a yellow that is a product of a natural aging process, that he was able to propose these not so much as a like, check it out, my yellow dress. He was proposing yellow as something that could just be a normal part of the wardrobe. It's a really difficult thing to do with a really extreme color. I also really love how the theme of aging gets continued by this season's statement about garment linings. We have what is probably the standout piece from this season that features the yellowed PVC belt and a dress that's been ripped sideways in the middle. Again, this continues the theme of linings fighting the main garment for dominance, and here seen violently ripping through the middle of the garment to make itself known. We find ourselves today in spring-summer 2004. This show took place at the Museum of Modern Art of the city of Paris, but most fashion fans know that by the building's name, which is the Palais de Tokyo. If this isn't ringing any bells, this is where all the Rick Owens shows happen. They happen outside in the courtyard behind the building. It's also where like 30 or 40% of all Fashion Week shows happen currently in Paris. This is my personal favorite building in Paris, and it is where the Maison has finally found itself. The Palais was going through renovations at that point, so guests had to enter through a side entrance that was covered in graffiti. I wish we had images of that, but we don't. Once again, the Maison does a variation on their runway format of introducing the looks one at a time. We remember that this is done so that the baggage of, "This is a runway show," can be diffused. Introducing outfits in this way hopefully makes it where guests will appreciate them more as clothing primarily, rather than focusing on the spectacle of it being a runway show. One moment, please. Hi, folks.
Now I know what you're thinking. How could this guy, Bliss, get any cooler? I just landed an interview as a shift manager at an ice cream store. So, I don't know. Sounds like there's a bit of a competition here. Place your votes. All right. Love ya. Get wet!
Jeez, I'm so sorry about that, folks. Hey, look, if you want to watch the entire Margiela series, like all of the episodes, and see the entire episodes and not just these clipped public versions, you should join the Patreon. We're not just plugging the Patreon anymore, folks. It's a entertaining part of the episode. Please, folks, please join my Patreon. Back to it. The soundtrack for this show actually tells us something pretty funny about Martin as a person. It was all like the diva-style 70s disco hits. I've spoken to a former owner of a Margiela store who was there during the early 2000s, and he said that Martin loved singers like Barbra Streisand. That was actually something that he and Martin bonded over, was Barbra Streisand. And in keeping with that theme, we have a very Margiela take on that era of glamour. Many fashion historians and critics cite the 1970s as the golden era of modern fashion. Andre Leon Talley's autobiography certainly seemed to pitch the 70s as the absolute height of fashion. And it's really funny because as much as Martin seems to be using his platform within fashion to kind of criticize or point out flaws in the fashion system or in just clothes generally, he seems to be doing a pretty low-key ode to this era of fashion here. Or at least to this era of glamour. I don't know if it's like the fashion so much because this is still very distinctly his look, but the jewelry especially sort of seems to identify this as kind of a very precious era to Martin personally. We remember that Martin's career is kind of based on criticizing the type of glamour from the 80s. The big shoulders, the kind of unachievable, glowing, angelic, rich girl type beauty, but apparently the 70s are fair game for him. He seems to really love them. And that does kind of make sense. Martin would have turned 13 in 1970. So these were kind of the most formative years of his life and sort of the period when he was developing his aesthetic taste. But critics at the time were really confused by this collection. Some even guessed that the helm of avant-garde might need to be taken up by some younger designer. Which, joke's on them, this was just a slow season. Martin continued to make great stuff for the next few years. So you might be able to guess that there is some discussion in the contrast between the front and the back of an outfit. We can see that done most obviously in the tabbies, which are split at the sides so that there's one color in the front, one color in the back, and that's also reflected in the tights, which are bisected by color, so there's one in the front and one in the back. Focusing on the front is seen in other elements of the presentation as well, most obviously in that the hair is teased and brushed all the way to the front. We can even see that the back of their hair is tied up to make up for all of the hair that couldn't be pushed all the way forward to the front. But by focusing on the front, that doesn't necessarily mean that the back is being ignored here. Some of the tops look as though they're constructed in a way that you'd expect to be relatively normal, or with the expectation of seeing a full back. Then when the model turns around, it's an entirely backless top, held by thin ribbons around the neck or connected at the base of the neck in some of the product. And this looks really purposeful here. This season seems to essentially be an exercise for the Maison, where the prompt is focus only on the front of clothes and let's see what we can learn. Unfortunately, that means that there's not a lot of like symbolism or latent meaning in this collection. It's just kind of an exercise that they were doing as a group. And that's okay. By the way, if anybody does have a reading on this season, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Please feel free to go into as much detail as you want. I read all of the comments. But do you remember back in spring-summer 2002, the Maison adopted a few different techniques for presenting clothes? They had like ones that were the circle. They had another one that was the folds, and that was by far the coolest one. And if I remember correctly, I said at the time that that technique could have been a whole season all on its own. Well, we see a continuation of the folded technique here in this one. And what's interesting to note here is that I'm not reading ahead. I'm actually learning about these seasons in order with you all. Like I'm doing them one or maybe two seasons at a time. Anyway, the lookbook images feature a descriptive text that gives us more context to how these clothes were made. Like, quote, a length of white crepe folded to evoke a two-piece suit, and this one that says, quote, elasticated tulle folded to evoke a dress with a waistcoat, etc., etc. This season is important for a number of different reasons. One of those reasons being that this was the year that the Maison moved into the headquarters that they just recently moved out of. It was a Sisters of Charity convent for a number of years, and then it was purchased and became a school of industrial design and then the Maison moved in. They literally just, here in 2022, they just moved out of this headquarters. I've been there a couple of times. It is a absolutely beautiful location, and it will be very badly missed. Anyway, that's totally anecdotal. Moving on. Before we wrap up the public version of this episode, I want to read a short essay by Vanessa Beecroft about the Maison and what it means to her. We've had some shorter episodes lately, and that's just because I'm just saying what I see. I'm trying not to add in any fluff or any forced content into this kind of stuff, so I figure we could use a little bit longer episode this time. So we're going to keep looking at footage from this season and read the beautiful words of Vanessa Beecroft. Beauty comes with the threat of its end, the tacit knowledge that it won't last forever. We have a problem with this, and we get caught in the illusion of never-ending beauty. Maison Martin Margiela is candid about beauty. Its beauty comes with faults, burns, rips, memories of the past, dreams, tragedy. This beauty is surreal, asymmetrical, has no gender, it has no status. It is not sexist, it is not luxury, it's not money, it is not class. It's white, it's black, and it's a replica, not a false reinterpretation. When we own a Maison Martin Margiela piece, we attach to something that looks as if it has already undergone life and lost those elements that introduce the illusion of the everlasting. This garment is conceptually permanent because its temporary quality is part of its look. It's a picture of life after the fact, even before it happened. What moves me most is that this tear or burn or misfit feels unique, as if it were custom made for me. That is taken from the Maison Martin Margiela book. This one, I've had to cut it up a whole bunch in order to make this series work. So like all of these are essentially like loose leaf little things in here. Oh, it just occurred to me that I'm sure the lighting completely messed up when that all white book came into frame. Hey, go join the Patreon so that you can watch the full extended episodes. We still have a shit ton to cover because there was a lot of product from this season. We're just about halfway done here. Go join it up, support the channel, watch the full extended episodes, watch all the exclusive videos, the extra Margiela stuff, the extra stuff having to do with the other things that I cover. I love you all a lot. I mean it. Goodbye. Did you finish it? All right, comment down below if you actually finished the entire video. Seriously, thank you so much for joining me. I've had such an incredible response to this series, and it has meant the world to me. It's kind of crazy to me that everyone cares about this as much as I do. Again, the Margiela series is still running. We're doing about one new episode every month, and those just come out on the channel like regular. They're just regular 10 to 15 minute episodes, and if you want to watch the full episodes, as you have heard many times over the course of this mega video, you should join the Patreon. I love you all a ton. I'll talk to you soon. Peace.